Hello everyone, and welcome back to Midnight Horror. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the video. Story 1. The road stretched endlessly before me, winding through fields of tall grass and scattered trees. The sky had turned a soft shade of orange, the last remnants of daylight fading behind the hills. I had been driving for hours, the hum of the engine the only sound breaking the silence. As I rounded a bend, I spotted a figure standing near the side of the road. He was a hitchhiker, tall and thin, dressed in dark clothing that made him blend into the shadows. His arm was outstretched, thumb pointing upward, but his face was obscured by the brim of his hat. I wasn't in the habit of picking up strangers, so I drove past without slowing down. A chill crawled up my spine as I glanced at him in the rearview mirror. He didn't turn to watch me go, he simply stood there, motionless, as I disappeared down the road. The countryside was empty, no houses or gas stations in sight, just miles of open fields. The road twisted again, leading through a dense cluster of trees where the light barely reached the pavement. When I emerged from the other side, I felt my breath catch in my throat. The hitchhiker was there again, standing by the roadside as if he had never moved. My hands tightened on the wheel, heart pounding as I sped past him. This time I dared to look directly at him, and though his head was still slightly lowered, I could see a grin just beneath the brim of his hat. I drove faster, my nerves on edge, trying to shake the unease that had settled over me. It wasn't possible there were no side roads, no shortcuts he could have taken. I kept my eyes on the empty stretch ahead, refusing to check my mirrors again. Minutes passed, the silence in the car growing heavier. The sun had almost completely set now, the sky a deep shade of blue. I gripped the wheel, forcing myself to stay calm, but my knuckles were white against the leather. Another turn came, leading me into another stretch of lonely road. My stomach twisted as I saw him again, this time closer to the pavement. He stood just at the edge, inches from where my car would pass, his head tilted slightly upward. I barely saw his eyes, but they were open wide, gleaming in the last light of the evening. That twisted grin was still there, stretching too wide across his face. Panic surged through me, and I pressed harder on the gas, my pulse hammering in my ears. I had to be imagining things, my exhaustion playing tricks on me. There was no way he could have gotten ahead of me, not in this empty stretch of road. Yet my skin prickled with cold, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was getting closer each time. The road ahead dipped, leading into a valley surrounded by darkened trees. I forced myself to focus on the drive, keeping my speed steady. The thought of seeing him again made my stomach churn, but I told myself I had left him behind for good. Then, just as I reached the bottom of the valley, my headlights caught movement up ahead. My breath stopped as I saw him standing directly in the center of the road. He was facing me this time, his body still, his arms hanging limply at his sides. I slammed on the brakes, tires screeching as I veered to avoid him. The car skidded, and for a split second, I thought I was going to crash. But then I was past him, my heart hammering so violently I could barely think. Gasping for breath, I looked in the rearview mirror, expecting to see him still standing there. The road behind me was empty, no sign of him anywhere. My hands trembled as I gripped the wheel, trying to steady my breathing. I kept driving, unwilling to slow down until I was miles away. My mind raced with questions, but no answers made sense. The road remained empty, the night stretching endlessly ahead of me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still there. When I finally saw the glow of a town in the distance, relief flooded through me. The lights of buildings and street lamps cut through the darkness, making me feel safer. I pulled into a gas station, my legs weak as I stepped out of the car. Inside, the cashier glanced up as I walked in, his eyes flicking toward me with mild interest. I hesitated before asking, my voice unsteady. "Have you ever seen a hitchhiker out on the road?" The man's expression darkened, and he leaned on the counter, studying me. "You saw him." His tone was cautious, like he already knew the answer. I nodded, my mouth dry. 3 times. He kept getting closer. The cashier exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "You're lucky you didn't stop." He looked toward the window, as if expecting to see someone standing outside. Not everyone who sees him makes it to town. A chill crept over me, and I turned to follow his gaze. The parking lot was empty, my car sitting alone beneath the fluorescent lights. But beyond that, just past the edge of the station's glow, the darkness seemed thicker, stretching like an open maw. I left as quickly as I could, the gas station growing smaller in my mirror as I drove away. The town felt safer, but the night no longer did. Even as I checked into a motel and locked my door, I knew I wouldn't sleep easily. Somewhere out on that road, the hitchhiker was still waiting, and next time I might not be fast enough. Story 2. The hotel had stood for over a century, its grand architecture a reminder of another era. The lobby was dimly lit, with old chandeliers casting a soft, golden glow. A faint scent of aged wood and something slightly musty lingered in the air. The receptionist, an older woman with a polite but distant expression, handed me my key and gave me brief instructions on how to find my room. The hallway leading to my room was long and narrow, the carpet plush but faded with time. The wallpaper was peeling in some areas, revealing the layers beneath. I passed several doors, each with brass numbers worn smooth by years of use. My room was at the end of the hall, farthest from the staircase, and the key turned in the lock with a heavy click. Inside, the room was spacious but outdated, with antique furniture and heavy drapes that blocked out most of the light. A large bed with an intricately carved headboard stood against the far wall. To the right, a small writing desk sat beneath an old mirror, its glass slightly warped. In the corner, an armoire loomed, and beside it, a closet with a narrow wooden door stood slightly ajar. Dropping my bag on the bed, I went to inspect the closet. The door creaked as I pulled it open, revealing an empty space with a wooden rod for hanging clothes. The light inside flickered for a moment before settling into a dim glow. That was when I noticed the scratches deep, erratic marks gouged into the wood. The grooves were uneven, crisscrossing in a frantic pattern along the inside of the door. Some were shallow, while others dug deep into the wood, as if made by desperate fingers. My stomach tightened at the sight, a strange unease creeping over me. It looked like someone had clawed at the door, trying to escape. I ran my fingers over the marks, the rough texture sending a chill through me. It didn't seem like simple wear and tear. These scratches had purpose, desperation behind them. I stepped back, suddenly aware of how silent the room had become. The air felt heavy, as if the walls held secrets long forgotten. Shaking off the feeling, I closed the closet door and turned my attention elsewhere. I told myself the scratches were old, likely there for years. Maybe it was some prank by a former guest, or maybe an animal had gotten trapped inside at some point. Still, a lingering unease followed me as I unpacked my bag. Later that evening, I went downstairs for dinner, the dining room nearly empty except for a few scattered guests. The hotel had a strange atmosphere, as if time had settled differently within its walls. The waiter, a man in his 60s, moved with practiced ease, refilling glasses and taking orders. When he reached my table, I hesitated before speaking. "This place has a lot of history, doesn't it?" I asked, keeping my tone light. "Ever had any strange stories about the rooms?" He paused, his expression unreadable for a moment. "Depends on what you mean by strange," he said, pouring water into my glass. "Old buildings have their fair share of ghost stories. Some folks say they hear things at night, scratching, knocking. But it's just the way these old places settle, I'd reckon." I nodded, but his words didn't put me at ease. When I returned to my room, the air inside felt colder than before. The drapes shifted slightly, though the windows were closed. The closet door stood open again, though I was sure I had closed it before leaving. Swallowing hard, I walked over and shut it firmly, pressing my palm against the wood for an extra second. I climbed into bed, telling myself it was nothing, just an old door that didn't latch properly. But as I lay in the dark, the silence pressed against my ears, thick and unnatural. Somewhere in the room, a soft sound broke the stillness. A faint scraping, like nails dragging over wood. My breath caught as I turned toward the closet, my eyes adjusting to the dim light. The door remained closed, but the sound continued, slow and deliberate. I sat up, my heart pounding against my ribs. The noise stopped instantly, as if whatever was making it knew I was listening. For a long moment I didn't move, barely even breathed. The room felt wrong, as if I was no longer alone. Reaching for my phone, I turned on the flashlight and aimed it at the closet. The light cast long shadows across the walls, but nothing was out of place. My fingers trembled as I stepped out of bed, my pulse hammering. Slowly, I reached for the handle and pulled the door open. The closet was empty, but the scratches, there were more now. Fresh ones, carving deeper into the wood. I stumbled back, a cold dread seizing my chest. Something had been inside. Something was still here. The air grew thick, suffocating. My breath came in ragged gasps as I grabbed my bag, my only thought to get out. As I turned toward the door, the closet creaked behind me. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I fled down the hallway, my footsteps echoing against the walls. The receptionist barely looked up as I rushed past, my only words breathless. "I need to check out." She nodded as if she had heard it before, sliding a ledger toward me without question. Outside, the night air was crisp, cutting through the lingering weight in my chest. I didn't stop until I reached my car, my hands shaking as I started the engine. The hotel loomed behind me, its windows dark and empty. I never told anyone what happened. I didn't want to know if others had seen the same thing, if others had heard the scratching in the night. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I still see the marks on the closet door. And I wonder, was someone trying to get out? Or was something trying to keep them in? Story 3. The farmhouse stood at the edge of a vast, overgrown field, its paint stripped away by years of harsh weather. The windows were dark, gaping holes, and the front porch sagged beneath the weight of time. I hesitated before stepping forward, my boots crunching on the dried grass. Something about the place felt wrong, but curiosity pushed me onward. The door groaned as I pushed it open, revealing a dimly lit interior coated in dust. The scent of damp wood and decay filled my nose, mingling with something faintly metallic. Broken furniture lay scattered across the floor, their jagged edges catching the fading sunlight. The silence was oppressive, thick like the air before a storm. I took careful steps through the entryway, my eyes scanning the peeling wallpaper and sagging ceiling. A rusted chandelier hung crookedly above me, its glass ornaments missing or shattered. The place had been abandoned for years, yet there were no signs of animals or squatters. It was as if time had simply stopped inside these walls. As I moved deeper into the house, my gaze was drawn to the far corner of the living room. A single rocking chair sat there, gently swaying back and forth. My breath caught in my throat as I realized there was no breeze, no draft to move it. The wood creaked softly, the sound sending chills down my spine. Next to the chair was a small wooden table, and on it sat a plate of food. The meal looked fresh, steaming, untouched, as though someone had just set it down. My stomach twisted at the impossibility of it. I inched closer, my pulse pounding in my ears, straining to see if my mind was playing tricks on me. The scent of warm stew filled the air, thick and savory, making my mouth water despite my unease. The silverware was neatly placed beside the plate, its handle gleaming under the dim light. There was no dust on the table, no signs of age or rot. It didn't belong in a house that had clearly been abandoned for decades. A sudden creak from the floorboards behind me made me whip around. The room was empty, the doorway leading into a darkened hall stretching deeper into the house. My skin prickled with the feeling of being watched, though I saw no one. The rocking chair continued to move, steady and unbothered. Swallowing hard, I turned back to the plate of food, my fingers hovering just above the table. The warmth radiating from it was real, undeniable. Someone or something had placed it here recently. I glanced at the chair again, half expecting to see an invisible figure occupying it, but it remained empty. The air in the room grew heavy, pressing against my chest like a weight. I took a step back, my instincts screaming at me to leave. The chair slowed its movement, the creaking softening into near silence. Then, without warning, the plate shifted, dragging slightly across the wood with an eerie scrape. I stumbled backward, knocking into an old cabinet, sending a cloud of dust into the air. My breathing came in sharp gasps as I watched the plate settle back into place. The silverware rattled slightly, as if unseen fingers had brushed against them. A cold sweat broke out along my spine, and I wiped my hands against my jeans, my palms clammy. I turned on my heel and moved toward the doorway, my every nerve on edge. The floor groaned beneath my weight, each step feeling heavier than the last. As I reached the threshold, a whisper brushed against my ear, low and breathy. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable warning, urging, pleading. My body went rigid, my breath caught in my throat. I spun around, my eyes darting wildly across the room, searching for the source. The chair had stopped rocking, the plate now completely still. The silence was deafening, wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket. A distant sound echoed from upstairs, a slow, deliberate footstep. Then another, and another. My heart pounded so loudly I could feel it in my fingertips. I wasn't alone in the house. Something or someone was moving above me. Every instinct told me to run, to leave and never look back. But my feet felt rooted to the floor, my mind grappling with the impossibility of it all. The footsteps grew louder, approaching the staircase, the weight of each step heavy and deliberate. I forced myself to move, stumbling toward the front door. The old wood groaned as I pushed against it, my sweaty hands slipping on the worn brass knob. Finally, with a sharp creak, it gave way and I burst outside, gulping in the crisp evening air. The sky had darkened, the farmhouse now a looming shadow behind me. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. My breath came in ragged gasps, my mind reeling with what I had just seen. As the engine roared to life, I risked one last glance at the house. The front door was still open, swaying slightly in the wind. But in the dim glow of my headlights, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The rocking chair had started moving again, its steady rhythm undisturbed. And through the window, Barely visible in the darkness was the faint outline of a figure standing at the top of the stairs. Watching, waiting. Story 4. The trail leading toward the abandoned asylum was overgrown, winding through dense clusters of trees and uneven ground. The building had been left to rot for decades, its windows shattered, its walls covered in ivy. I had read about it online, a relic of the past, standing on the outskirts of town like a forgotten ghost. The stories surrounding it ranged from unsettling to outright terrifying, but curiosity had always been my weakness. The sun was beginning to dip below the tree line as I moved closer, my boots crunching against dead leaves. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, and the distant call of birds echoed through the trees. I told myself I wouldn't go inside, just close enough to take a few pictures before heading back. The asylum loomed ahead, its presence heavy, the broken windows gaping like empty eyes. I stepped carefully, my pulse quickening as I approached the front gates, rusted and slightly ajar. The silence here was different, pressing, as if the forest itself held its breath. I took a few steps forward, snapping a quick photo of the crumbling structure. Just as I lowered my phone, I heard it a whisper, soft and unmistakable, saying my name. I froze, the sound sending a chill through my spine. The wind had picked up slightly, rustling the leaves around me, but this hadn't been the wind. It had been clear, deliberate, spoken just behind me. My breath caught in my throat as I turned slowly, scanning the empty trail. There was no one there. My mind raced for a rational explanation, but my skin prickled with something primal, something that told me I wasn't alone. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breathing. Maybe it had been my imagination, or maybe a trick of the wind carrying distant sounds. I decided to leave, my body tense with unease as I backed away from the gate. The asylum stood in eerie silence, the broken doorway yawning open as if inviting me inside. I ignored the pull of curiosity and turned back toward the trail, determined to put some distance between myself and the decaying structure. The whisper came again, closer this time, right at my ear. I spun around so fast that I nearly lost my footing, my heart hammering against my ribs. The trees cast long shadows in the fading light, their branches swaying gently. I clenched my fists, my skin crawling with the sensation that something unseen was watching. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs felt rooted in place. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. My mouth was dry as I took a hesitant step back, scanning every inch of the path. I needed to leave, but something in me, some deep, unnerving part, wanted to hear it again, as if the whisper carried something I wasn't meant to understand. The sun was slipping lower, painting the sky in deep orange and purple hues. The forest, once a place of solitude, now felt wrong, its air heavy with unseen weight. I turned sharply and started walking, my pace quick but controlled. I refused to run, no matter how much my body screamed at me to do so. The whisper followed me, my name slipping through the air like a breath. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an echo. It was something else. My hands trembled as I pulled my phone from my pocket, recording the empty space behind me. I walked faster, my pulse pounding, the asylum shrinking behind me as the trees swallowed it from view. The whisper didn't stop. It moved with me, never growing distant, always just at my back. My own name had never sounded so foreign, so wrong. Panic settled deep in my chest, my breath coming in uneven gasps. I could feel something just beyond my vision, something waiting for me to turn around. I kept walking, my fingers gripping my phone so tightly they ached. My ears strained for anything else, footsteps, movement, but there was nothing. Just a whisper. I reached the edge of the trail, where the trees began to thin, where my car sat waiting on the gravel road. Relief flooded through me, but I didn't slow down. I fumbled for my keys, glancing over my shoulder one last time. The whisper was gone, but the air still felt charged, like whatever had spoken my name was still watching. I slid into my car, locking the doors as soon as I was inside. My hands shook as I pulled up the recording, my stomach twisting as I pressed play. The first few seconds were nothing but the sound of my footsteps crunching over leaves. Then, just before the video ended, I heard it. A breath, low and deliberate, followed by a voice whispering my name. I dropped the phone, my blood running cold. I had been alone, completely, unquestionably alone. But something had been there, close enough to speak, close enough to follow. My throat was dry as I forced myself to breathe, my mind racing for answers that didn't exist. I never hiked that trail again. The asylum remained as it always had, a decaying monument to whatever lingered inside. Some places carry echoes of the past, remnants of lives long gone. But some places are different. Some places still whisper, waiting for someone to listen. Story 5. The drive to the cabin had been long, the winding roads cutting through dense forest with no signs of civilization for miles. The rental listing had promised solitude, a quiet getaway from the noise of the city. As I pulled up to the small wooden structure, a sense of unease settled over me, though I told myself it was just the unfamiliar stillness. Stepping inside, I found the cabin to be exactly as advertised: rustic, simple, and eerily quiet. A fireplace sat in the corner, unlit, and a single window faced the dense wall of trees. The air was stale, carrying a faint scent of old wood and something else, something faintly metallic. I dropped my bag on the couch and wandered into the small bedroom. A single bed with a thick quilt sat against the wall, and the nightstand rested beside it. On the nightstand, a small black journal lay open, its worn pages yellowed at the edges. Curious, I picked it up and flipped through the pages. The entries were mundane at first: notes about the weather, descriptions of hikes, and thoughts about the peaceful isolation. But as I neared the end, the handwriting grew more erratic, the sentences shorter, almost frantic. My stomach tightened as I read the final entry. 3 words scrawled hastily across the page: don't sleep. The ink looked fresh, as if it had been written recently. A shiver ran down my spine, though I quickly dismissed it as a bad joke, or the ramblings of an overactive imagination. I set the journal back down and tried to push it from my mind. After unpacking a few essentials, I lit the fireplace, hoping its warmth would make the cabin feel more inviting. The flames crackled, casting flickering shadows along the wooden walls, but the unease remained. As night settled over the forest, the quiet became oppressive. There were no distant sounds of cars, no hum of electricity, just the occasional creak of the cabin settling and the whisper of wind through the trees. I locked the door, checked the window latches, and settled into bed with my phone in hand. Sleep didn't come easily. The words from the journal looped through my mind, refusing to be ignored. Every time my eyes drifted shut, I swore I heard something: a faint shuffling outside, a soft tap against the window. When I turned to look, there was nothing but darkness. Sometime past midnight, I must have dozed off because I woke to a sharp, rhythmic knocking. My heart pounded as I sat up, straining to hear. The knocking came again, louder this time, and it wasn't coming from the door, it was coming from the window. I turned slowly, my breath caught in my throat. The curtains were drawn, but I could see the faintest outline of something standing just beyond the glass. It was tall, unmoving, and too still to be human. My body went rigid, every instinct screaming at me to stay silent. The knocking stopped, replaced by a slow, deliberate scraping along the window pane. I didn't dare move. The only sound in the room was my own breathing, ragged and uneven. The thing outside lingered for what felt like an eternity before the scraping finally ceased. I stayed frozen in bed until the first light of dawn broke through the trees. Only then did I force myself to get up and pull back the curtain. There was nothing outside, no footprints, no signs that anyone had been there. But as I looked closer, I saw the glass was fogged over, as if someone or something had been breathing against it. The unease clawed at my stomach as I hurriedly packed my things. I wanted to believe it had been my imagination, but deep down I knew better. Something had been there. Something had been watching. I grabbed the journal before leaving, shoving it into my bag without fully understanding why. As I drove away, I forced myself not to look in the rearview mirror. The further I got from the cabin, the lighter I felt, as if something had loosened its grip on me. When I finally reached a gas station, I pulled into the parking lot and sat for a moment, catching my breath. The journal sat on the passenger seat, taunting me with its presence. Against my better judgment, I flipped it open to the last page. A new entry had appeared, written in my own handwriting. You should have listened. Story 6. The lake was calm when I arrived, its glassy surface reflecting the overcast sky. The campsite was secluded, just a small clearing surrounded by dense trees, with the water only a short walk away. I set up my tent near the fire pit, unpacking my gear and preparing for a quiet night. The air smelled of damp earth and pine, and the gentle lapping of water against the shore was the only sound. As the sun dipped behind the trees, I built a small fire, watching the flames flicker and dance in the evening breeze. The lake had an eerie stillness to it, the kind that made you feel like you weren't truly alone. I ate my dinner in silence, occasionally glancing toward the water. Something about it unsettled me, but I couldn't quite place why. By the time I crawled into my tent, the fire had died down to glowing embers. The air inside was cool, and the distant hoot of an owl was the only noise cutting through the night. I zipped my sleeping bag up to my chest, letting the exhaustion from the long day take over. Sleep came quickly, pulling me into deep, dreamless rest. Sometime in the night, I stirred, feeling an odd sense of unease. The air was still, thick with silence, and for a moment I couldn't understand what had woken me. I strained to listen, but there was nothing, no rustling leaves, no chirping insects, just an unnatural quiet that sent a chill down my spine. I shifted inside my sleeping bag, reaching for my phone to check the time. The screen read 3:12 a.m. I sighed, trying to shake the feeling that something was off. Just as I was about to settle back into sleep, a faint sound reached my ears, a slow, wet, slapping noise like footsteps against damp ground. My breath caught in my throat as I lay frozen, listening. The steps were close, much too close, and they stopped right outside my tent. My pulse pounded as I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. But then, the faint shadow of a footprint appeared against the thin fabric of the tent wall. Swallowing hard, I forced myself to move, slowly unzipping my sleeping bag. My hands trembled as I reached for the flashlight beside me. I hesitated for a long moment, debating whether or not I wanted to see what was out there. Then, with a deep breath, I flicked the light on and unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The beam of my flashlight swept across the ground, illuminating the damp earth. My stomach twisted as I saw them footprints, leading straight to my tent. They were large, deeper at the heels, as if someone had walked straight out of the lake and stopped right in front of me. The water glistened in the faint light, trailing off into the darkness. I shuddered, my mind racing with explanations. I hadn't gone near the water, and I was alone. I forced myself to scan the campsite, moving the flashlight slowly over the trees, The fire pit, the lake's edge. Nothing moved, and the silence felt heavier than before. I wanted to believe the footprints were just a trick of the light, but the wetness soaking into the soul told me otherwise. I stayed inside the tent, gripping the flashlight so tightly my fingers ached. Minutes passed, then an hour, but nothing else happened. Finally, exhaustion overtook fear, and I drifted back into uneasy sleep. When I woke again, the first light of dawn filtered through the fabric of my tent. The air was cool and damp, carrying the scent of the lake. I unzipped the tent fully, stepping outside hesitantly. The footprints were still there, dark and unmistakable, leading from the lake's edge to my tent and then stopping. There were no returning prints, no signs of someone walking away. It was as if whoever had come to my tent had simply vanished. A shiver ran down my spine as I scanned the water. The surface was still, unbroken, as if nothing had ever disturbed it. But I knew what I had seen. My gut told me to pack up and leave, but curiosity kept me rooted in place. I walked slowly to the lake's edge, staring at the water. Something about it seemed different now, almost too smooth, as if it was waiting for something. I crouched down, running my fingers through the wet soil where the footprints began. The earth was cold, unnaturally so, and a strange sense of unease settled over me. I stood up quickly, my heartbeat hammering in my ears. The feeling of being watched crept over me, prickling at the back of my neck. I turned sharply, scanning the trees, the tent, the empty fire pit. No one was there, yet the sensation didn't fade. I could feel it, something unseen lingering just out of reach. I didn't waste another second. I packed up my gear hastily, stuffing my sleeping bag and supplies into my backpack. Every now and then, I glanced toward the lake, half expecting something to emerge from its depths. The footprints remained, a silent reminder that I had not been alone. As I loaded my gear into my car, I hesitated one last time, looking back at the quiet campsite. The trees stood motionless, the lake as undisturbed as ever. But I knew better. Something had been there, something that had come from the water in the dead of night. I climbed into the driver's seat, gripping the wheel tightly. As I started the engine, I glanced at my rearview mirror, my breath hitching. Standing at the water's edge was a figure, tall, unmoving, watching. I blinked, my pulse pounding, but by the time I looked again, it was gone. I drove away without looking back, leaving the lake and its secrets behind me. But even now, I can't shake the feeling that whatever left those footprints hadn't just disappeared. It had been watching, waiting, and somehow I knew it wasn't finished. Story 7. The road stretched endlessly before me, flanked by dry fields and scattered trees, their branches clawing at the sky. My gas gauge had been dipping lower for miles, and I had yet to see another car or town in either direction. The sun hung low, casting long shadows over the cracked pavement as I started to accept the possibility of being stranded. Then, just ahead, I spotted at a gas station, small and isolated, its neon sign flickering weakly. Relief flooded through me as I slowed down, pulling into the lot. The pumps were old, their metal rusted, but the building itself looked intact, the glass windows reflecting the dying light of the sun. Stepping out, I scanned the surroundings, noting the complete silence. No cars, no people, no hum of passing trucks on the highway. Just the wind whispering through the abandoned lot, stirring up bits of dust and old leaves. The door to the station creaked as I pushed it open, the scent of stale air and faint oil filling my nose. Inside, the store was stocked shelves lined with canned food, bottled drinks, and snacks. It was as if someone had locked the place up one night and never returned. I grabbed a can of soup from a shelf, turning it over in my hand. The label was faded, the edges curled, but what caught my eye was the date April 2, 1984. My stomach tightened as I checked another can, then a third. Every single item bore the same expiration date, 40 years ago to the day. The refrigerator hummed softly, the glass door fogged with condensation. I reached inside, my fingers wrapping around a cold bottle of soda. The liquid inside was dark, unshaken, as if it had been sitting there undisturbed for decades. When I wiped away the condensation, the same date stared back at me. A chill ran down my spine. It didn't make sense. No store, not even an abandoned one, could remain so untouched, so perfectly preserved, after so many years. Dust covered the shelves, but the items inside looked pristine, as if they'd been waiting for someone to come along and pick them up. The register sat at the front, the old cash machine coated in a thin layer of grime. A small stack of receipts lay beside it, yellowed with age but undisturbed. I picked one up and scanned the faded ink. The last recorded purchase was on the same date, April 2, 1984. I turned toward the back of the store, where a door marked employees only stood slightly ajar. Something in me hesitated, a deep instinct warning me to turn around and leave. But curiosity tugged at me harder. If I could just find something, an explanation, a clue, maybe it would make sense. The door groaned as I pushed it open, revealing a narrow hallway lined with dusty filing cabinets and faded posters. A small office sat at the end, its desk cluttered with papers, a rusted keyring hanging from a hook beside it. An old calendar remained pinned to the wall, frozen in the same month and year. As I stepped inside, the floor creaked under my weight. Papers lay scattered across the desk, their edges curled with time. Among them, I found an old employee log, its last entry written in neat, looping handwriting. Closing up for the night. See you all tomorrow. The date, April 2nd, 1984. My breath hitched as a soft sound echoed behind me, a faint rustling, like someone shifting in place. I spun around, heart hammering, but the hallway was empty. The air felt heavier now, thick and unmoving, pressing in on me like unseen hands. I backed out of the office, my footsteps quickening as I moved toward the front of the store. The hum of the refrigerator seemed louder now, the buzzing lights above flickering slightly. My skin prickled as I reached for the door handle, desperate to leave. Then, just as my fingers touched the metal, the radio behind the counter crackled to life. The sound was warped, static-filled, as if coming from somewhere impossibly distant. A voice broke through, faint and distorted, but unmistakable. Attention all customers, store closing in 5 minutes. I bolted. The door flew open, the bell above it jangling violently as I stumbled into the night air. My car sat where I left it, the sight of it a welcome relief as I fumbled with my keys. The engine roared to life, but as I turned onto the road, I made the mistake of glancing into my rearview mirror. The gas station, once faded and abandoned, now glowed with the warmth of neon lights. The windows were no longer dark, but filled with movement, silhouettes of people shifting inside, as if the store had never closed at all. My foot slammed on the accelerator, the car speeding forward as I tore my eyes away. The radio inside my car crackled with static, and for a brief moment, just before the signal faded into nothingness, I swore I heard the same voice. Thank you for shopping with us. Come again soon. Story 8. The historic train station had been converted into a boutique hotel, its old world charm preserved in the worn brick walls and towering arched windows. The polished wooden floors creaked beneath my steps as I made my way to the front desk. A young woman in a pressed uniform smiled politely as she handed me my room key, the brass tag cold in my palm. My room was on the 3rd floor, and the long hallway leading to it smelled faintly of aged paper and dust. Framed black and white photographs lined the walls, capturing moments of the station's past conductors waving, passengers in long coats, steam engines pulling into the platform. I glanced at each one as I passed, a strange unease settling in my stomach. There was something about the people in the photos, their eyes too sharp, as if watching. Unlocking my door, I stepped inside and let out a slow breath. The room was elegant yet simple, with vintage furnishings that complemented the building's history. Heavy velvet curtains framed a large window, and I pulled them aside, expecting to see the bustling city streets below. Instead, my stomach dropped. Outside, stretching far into the distance, lay a railway track bathed in pale moonlight. The steel rails gleamed faintly, disappearing into the tree line beyond. My hands tightened around the curtain. That couldn't be right. I had read about the station's history. Its tracks had been dismantled over a century ago. I pressed my forehead against the glass, my breath fogging the surface. The railway looked old but intact, as if trains still passed through in the dead of night. Yet I knew logically there was nothing there. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, breaking the spell, and I turned away from the window with a shiver. Trying to shake the unease, I unpacked my bag, setting my clothes in the small wardrobe. The room was silent except for the faint ticking of the wall clock. The heater hummed softly, its warmth failing to chase away the chill that had settled in my bones. I climbed into bed, telling myself the railway was a trick of the mind, an illusion caused by the way the land stretched below. Sometime past midnight, I woke to a distant whistle. It was faint, almost swallowed by the wind, but unmistakable. My pulse quickened as I pushed back the covers and moved toward the window. My fingers trembled as I parted the curtains. The railway was no longer empty. A train, black as night, sat on the tracks, its engine idling with a low, rhythmic churning. Lanterns glowed dimly along its length, casting flickering light onto the gravel below. I strained to see movement, but the train cars were closed, their dark windows reflecting only the night. A shadow shifted near the locomotive, and my breath hitched. A figure stood just beyond the glow of the lanterns, tall and unmoving. I couldn't make out details, only the distinct shape of a long coat and a hat. My chest tightened as I realized they were staring up at my window. I stumbled back, heart pounding against my ribs. The heater suddenly clicked off, plunging the room into a heavy silence. The air felt thick, pressing in from all sides. Another whistle cut through the night, closer this time. Forcing myself to move, I grabbed my phone and snapped a photo of the railway. The moment my camera flashed, the light in my room flickered violently. The screen of my phone went black. A sharp knock echoed from my door. My breath hitched. The knock came again, louder, more insistent. I stood frozen, every nerve in my body screaming at me not to answer. The hotel was nearly empty. Who would be knocking at this hour? My throat tightened as I reached for the doorknob. Slowly, I turned the handle and pulled the door open a crack. The hallway was empty. A cold draft rushed past me, sending a shiver down my spine. I hesitated, then shut the door firmly, locking it. My heart was still racing when I turned back to the window. The train was gone. The railway lay empty once more, stretching into the darkness. My phone powered back on with a soft chime, and I hurriedly opened my camera roll. The photo I had taken was there, but something was wrong. The railway was in the image, exactly as I had seen it, but standing on the tracks was the shadowy figure, closer this time. Their face was obscured, but they were undeniably looking up at my window. My stomach twisted painfully. I hadn't seen them there when I took the picture. Sleep was impossible after that. I sat in the armchair near the window, watching, waiting. The silence felt unnatural, stretched too thin. Hours passed, and the first hints of dawn crept over the horizon, painting the sky in muted grays. I wasted no time checking out. The receptionist barely looked up as I slid my key across the counter. My voice felt hoarse as I asked, "Has anyone else ever seen the railway?" Her hands stilled over the register, fingers tightening ever so slightly. For a long moment she didn't speak. Then, without looking at me, she murmured, "Best not to ask about things that don't exist." Outside, the morning air was crisp, but the unease lingered. As I loaded my bag into my car, I glanced up at my hotel window one last time. The curtains fluttered slightly, though there was no breeze. I turned the key in the ignition, eager to leave the station-turned hotel far behind. As I pulled onto the road, I caught a glimpse of something in my rearview mirror. A figure in a long coat standing near the tracks, watching. Story 9. The old jailhouse stood at the edge of town, forgotten by time. Its stone walls were cracked, covered in patches of moss and grime. The iron bars on the windows were rusted, their edges corroded from years of exposure. Pushing open the heavy front door, I stepped inside, my footsteps echoing in the hollow space. Dust hung thick in the air, stirred by my presence. The scent of decay and old iron filled my nose, a mixture of dampness and rust. The main corridor stretched before me, lined with rows of empty cells. Some doors hung open, their locks broken, while others remained sealed shut. Graffiti covered the walls, the marks of trespassers who had come before me. Light filtered in through the small barred windows, casting long shadows across the floor. Chains and shackles lay discarded in the corners, remnants of a time long gone. The silence was thick, broken only by the occasional creak of the old building settling. I moved deeper into the jail, my fingers brushing along the cold metal bars. Some cells had worn mattresses, little more than torn fabric and stuffing. Others had only bare cots, rusted springs poking through the disintegrating frames. A door at the end of the hall caught my attention, heavier than the others. Faded letters above it read "Solitary Confinement," the words barely visible through the layers of dust. The handle was stiff, but with effort I pushed it open. The hallway beyond was even darker, the air colder. The cells here were smaller, their walls closing in tight. The atmosphere felt different, as if something lingered in the space between the shadows. I passed by the first few cells, glancing inside each one. Most were empty, their floors littered with debris. One had an old wooden chair, its back snapped in half, resting in the corner. At the very end of the hall, a door stood slightly ajar, its hinges groaning as I pushed it open. The solitary cell was cramped, its walls thick and unyielding. A single beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the door from the inside. My breath caught as I stepped closer, my eyes adjusting to the dimness. Deep grooves ran along the wooden surface, carved in jagged, desperate strokes. The marks were uneven, layered upon one another as if made over time. I reached out, my fingertips grazing the indentations. The scratches were deep, more than just surface-level damage. Whoever had made them had done so with force, their nails or tools digging into the wood with frenzied determination. The thought of someone trapped in this space, clawing at the door, sent a shiver through me. The marks trailed downward, leading toward the base where the wood had splintered. Some scratches overlapped, as if a second set of hands had tried to dig through. I stepped back, my stomach twisting as I turned my gaze to the walls. Faint scratches lined the stone, smaller but just as erratic. In the dim light, I could almost make out shapes, patterns that looked intentional. A sudden creak sounded behind me, breaking the silence. I spun around, my heart pounding, but the hallway remained empty. The only movement came from the dust settling in the air. I turned back toward the door, a sinking feeling pressing down on my chest. The claw marks seemed darker now, as if the shadows had deepened within them. My fingers twitched at my sides, an unease settling in my bones. A faint sound drifted through the cell, so soft I almost missed it. It was a whisper, low and raspy, just on the edge of hearing. The words were unclear, but they sent a chill through my spine. I stepped back, my pulse racing as the air in the room seemed to thicken. The light filtering through the tiny window flickered, as if something had passed in front of it. The air grew colder, wrapping around me like unseen fingers. I forced myself to move, stepping toward the door with quickening breaths. As I turned to leave, a final detail caught my eye. At the very bottom of the door, just beneath the deepest claw marks, something was carved into the wood. I crouched down, tracing the words with my fingertips. They were rough, hurried, but still legible. Still here. A sharp sound echoed through the cell, a scraping, like nails dragging across stone. My breath hitched as I turned, my eyes darting toward the walls. The scratches seemed to shimmer in the dim light, as if shifting beneath my gaze. The whisper came again, closer this time, more distinct. The air pressed down, suffocating in its weight. I stumbled backward, my hands brushing against the cold stone as I scrambled toward the door. The moment I crossed the threshold, the air lightened, the heaviness lifting. The hallway beyond was silent, the temperature warmer. I hesitated, glancing back into the cell, but nothing had changed. The scratches remained unmoving, just as they had been before. The words at the bottom of the door were still there, carved deep into the wood, but the whispers had stopped, the suffocating presence gone. I exhaled sharply, steadying myself before stepping back down the hallway. The weight of the jailhouse pressed around me, its history thick in the air. Each cell I passed felt darker now, as if something had woken in their depths. Reaching the main corridor, I turned one last time, my gaze trailing back towards solitary confinement. The door at the end of the hall stood open, the cell beyond hidden in shadow. A part of me wanted to go back, to take another look, but my instincts screamed otherwise. I stepped outside, the cold air sharp against my skin. The jailhouse loomed behind me, silent once more. I ran my fingers over my palm, only then realizing they were trembling. As I walked away, the wind carried a faint sound through the trees. It was distant, almost lost in the rustling leaves. A whisper, low and raspy, just on the edge of hearing. Story 10. The town had an old-fashioned charm, the kind that made it feel like time had stopped decades ago. Cobblestone streets wound between brick buildings, their faded signs advertising bakeries and antique shops. I had been traveling through the area, stopping for a break after driving for hours. The town was quiet, almost too quiet, as I walked down the sidewalk, taking in the stillness. The newspaper stand sat at the corner of the main street, its metal frame rusted but sturdy. A stack of newspapers lay inside, the top one displaying a bold headline in black ink. My footsteps slowed as I read the words, "Local tourist goes missing tonight." My stomach clenched when my eyes dropped to the accompanying photo, a picture of me, the same clothes I was wearing now, the same bewildered look I knew was on my face. A cold sensation crawled up my spine as I stared at the paper, trying to make sense of it. The date printed at the top was today's date, yet the article described my disappearance as though it had already happened. My name wasn't listed, but the details matched age, gender, even the description of my car parked just outside town. I reached out hesitantly, my fingers brushing the edge of the newspaper as if touching it would confirm the reality of what I was seeing. I turned, scanning the street for any sign of movement, but the town remained eerily still. The few people I had seen earlier were gone, and the shops seemed closed despite the afternoon sun still hanging in the sky. My heart pounded as I glanced at the storefronts, their windows reflecting my image back at me. I felt like I was being watched, though I saw no one. A soft rustling came from behind the stand, and I quickly stepped back, expecting someone to appear. But there was nothing, just the empty streets stretching in both directions. The wind picked up slightly, flipping the pages of the newspapers, as if urging me to read more. I hesitated before grabbing the top paper, scanning the article with a growing sense of unease. The report stated that I had last been seen walking down this very street, just minutes before vanishing without a trace. It mentioned witnesses who had claimed to see me stop at the newspaper stand, looking at the headline before fading away. My breath hitched as I read the last line, my mind struggling to process what it meant. No signs of struggle were found, and no explanation for their disappearance has been determined. I dropped the newspaper, my hands trembling as I stepped back. This had to be some kind of prank, some elaborate trick designed to scare visitors. But the deeper part of me knew better. This felt too specific, too real. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to get in my car and never look back. Yet my feet felt rooted to the ground, my body frozen in place. A shadow flickered in the reflection of a nearby shop window, making my breath hitch. I spun around, expecting to see someone standing behind me, but the street remained empty. My pulse pounded as I took a cautious step forward, peering into the glass. The reflection staring back at me wasn't quite right. Something about it was off, like a distorted version of myself. The figure in the reflection lifted a hand, though I had not moved. My stomach twisted as it smiled, an unnatural expression stretching across its face. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in sharp gasps as the reflection flickered and vanished. My mind reeled, every instinct screaming at me to run, yet the street around me seemed to shift, the buildings warping as though the town itself was changing. I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing unnaturally against the pavement. The street stretched longer than before, the distance to my car growing impossibly far. My breaths came in ragged bursts as I pushed forward, forcing my legs to move despite the tightening fear in my chest. Behind me, I heard the soft rustling of newspapers, followed by a whisper carried on the wind. "You were always meant to disappear." The voice was barely audible, but it sent a chill through my entire body. I didn't dare look back, focusing only on reaching my car. The streetlights flickered even though the sun was still shining, and the building seemed to close in, pressing against me. I fumbled for my keys in my pocket, my hands shaking as I finally reached my vehicle. I yanked the door open and jumped inside, locking it as I struggled to catch my breath. The silence in the car felt unnatural, pressing against my ears as though the world outside had stopped. My fingers fumbled as I turned the key in the ignition, praying the engine would start. The car rumbled to life, the sound grounding me for a moment, but then my heart stopped. In the rearview mirror, I saw myself still standing at the newspaper stand, staring down at the headline. My reflection, or whatever it was, turned its head slowly, locking eyes with me through the mirror. A sickening grin spread across its face as it raised a hand and waved. My blood ran cold as I slammed the car into drive, tires screeching as I sped away. The buildings blurred past me, the road stretching longer than it should have. No matter how fast I drove, the town refused to end, looping endlessly in my view. My grip tightened on the wheel, my breath coming in rapid gasps as panic threatened to overtake me. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard, but the numbers were frozen unchanging. A flicker in my peripheral vision made my stomach lurch. The passenger seat was no longer empty. I refused to look, keeping my eyes locked on the road, but I could feel the presence beside me. A breath, slow and deliberate, filled the silent space of the car. My own breath shuddered as I forced myself to focus, gripping the wheel tighter. "You were always meant to disappear," the voice whispered again, closer this time, right next to my ear. My entire body went rigid as my vision blurred, the edges of the town distorting like a fading dream. The last thing I saw before everything turned to darkness was my own reflection in the rearview mirror, watching me with hollow eyes. Story 11. The mountain lodge sat nestled between towering pine trees, its wooden beams weathered by time and the harsh mountain winds. It was remote, far from the nearest town, and surrounded by nothing but the vast, untouched wilderness. I had booked a weekend there, looking for some peace and solitude, away from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. The moment I arrived, the quiet seemed almost oppressive, as if the entire mountain was holding its breath. The lodge had a rustic charm, with a stone fireplace in the main room and old photographs on the walls. The air smelled faintly of pine and wood smoke, and the only sound was the occasional creak of the building settling into the mountain's embrace. The receptionist, an older woman with sharp eyes and a quiet demeanor, handed me the key to my room and wished me a pleasant stay. She didn't speak much, and her gaze lingered just a moment too long, as if sizing me up. I had noticed her eyes flick to the guest book on the counter when she handed me the key, but I didn't think much of it at the time. Once I settled into my room, I explored the lodge a bit more. The hallways were lined with old, faded rugs and wooden furniture that looked like it had been there for generations. As I wandered into the common area, I saw the guest book resting on a small table near the window. It caught my attention for some reason, and I decided to take a closer look. I flipped open the heavy leather-bound book, expecting to see the usual collection of names, dates, and brief comments from past guests. But as I turned the pages, I was struck by how strange it was. There, written in neat, careful handwriting, was one name repeated over and over again. At first, I thought it was a coincidence, but the further I flipped, the more I realized that every single page, from the very first entry to the most recent, had the same name written in it, Elias K. The name appeared hundreds of times, in different handwriting but always the same initials, sometimes with a date, sometimes without. I flipped through the pages more quickly, trying to make sense of it. The earliest entries dated back decades, and Elias K.'s name appeared just as frequently in each one. There was something unsettling about it, an eerie repetition that tugged at the edge of my mind. Who was this person, and why did their name fill the guest book year after year? I went back to the front desk and asked the receptionist about Elias K., but her face tightened at the mention of the name. "He's been coming here for years," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "But no one really knows much about him. He doesn't speak to anyone, just writes his name and leaves." Her response only made me more curious. I pressed further, asking how long Elias K. had been staying at the lodge. She hesitated before answering, as though the question itself disturbed her. "Longer than I've worked here, and I've been here for nearly 30 years, she replied, her tone becoming colder. "He's part of the lodge in a way, but he never stays for long. Always leaves before the next guest arrives." The answer didn't satisfy me, but I was determined to get to the bottom of it. I spent the rest of the evening in the lodge's common room, reading by the fire and trying to forget about Elias K. But as the hours wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I glanced toward the guest book, I could almost feel the weight of his name pressing down on me. That night, I couldn't sleep. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, and the sound of creaking wood filled the silence. I kept imagining Elias K., walking through the halls, his footsteps soft and deliberate, just out of sight. I finally decided to get up and investigate further, convinced that there was something I was missing. I returned to the guest book, flipping through the pages again, hoping to find some clue, some pattern that would explain the obsession with this one name. As I reached the final page, I noticed something strange there. At the bottom of the page was an entry that stood out. The handwriting was different from the others, less neat, more frantic. It was written in bold, uneven strokes, as though the person was in a hurry. The words read, "N. I am trapped here. Help me. Elias K." My blood ran cold as I stared at the words. I ran my fingers over the page, trying to make sense of it, but no matter how hard I looked, I couldn't find any explanation. I checked the date on the entry only a few months ago. Elias K. had written this, but why? And why had no one mentioned it? I couldn't stay in the room any longer. I needed answers. I ran down to the front desk, desperate to ask the receptionist more, but she was gone. The lobby was empty, and the entire lodge seemed unnaturally quiet. I stepped outside, the cold mountain air biting at my skin, and saw the dark outline of the lodge against the starry sky. It wasn't until I walked past the guest book table again that I noticed something chilling. The book was open, and on the most recent page there was a new entry, written in the same frantic handwriting as the one I had just read. It was a single line, scrawled hastily. "You shouldn't have come." I ran back to my room, slamming the door behind me, my heart pounding. The wind had picked up, and the sound of it howling through the trees seemed to carry voices, whispers, murmurs, and the faint sound of footsteps echoing through the empty halls. I glanced at the guest book one last time, but this time, it was different. There was no name written at the top of the page, just an empty space, waiting for something or someone to fill it. Story 12. The old dock had always been a quiet place, tucked away on the edge of a forgotten lake. It was the kind of spot that no one seemed to visit anymore. Weathered planks, rusted metal supports, and a general air of abandonment that seemed to shroud the area in mystery. I had heard stories about the place, whispers of strange occurrences and odd happenings, but I had never put much stock into those rumors. It was just a dock after all. I arrived in the late afternoon, the sun beginning its slow descent behind the tree line, casting long shadows across the water. I pulled my old fishing gear from the trunk of my car and made my way down the narrow, overgrown path that led to the dock. The air was thick with the scent of damp wood and the distant hum of cicadas. The only sounds were the occasional rustle of leaves and the soft lapping of water against the shore. The dock creaked beneath my weight as I set up my equipment, carefully tying my bait onto the end of the line. The water looked still, almost unnervingly so, like a glass surface waiting to be disturbed. I cast my line with a practiced flick of my wrist, watching as the lure skipped across the surface and disappeared into the depths. For a few moments, all was calm, just the quiet solitude of fishing, the peaceful rhythm of waiting. But then, the line went taut. It wasn't the usual tug I was accustomed to, the rhythmic pull of a fish nibbling at the bait. This was different. The line jerked hard, and before I could react, it was yanked violently to the side. My hand was yanked forward, the pole nearly torn from my grip as something on the other end fought against me. I struggled to keep a hold, but the force was too much. It was like trying to hold onto a live wire, the tension building with every passing second. The pole bent, the strain on the rod reaching a level I had never experienced. My knuckles turned white as I tried to reel in the catch, but the resistance was overpowering. It wasn't a fish. No fish could have pulled this hard, could have fought like this. My thoughts raced, panic creeping in. What the hell was on the other end? Before I could process what was happening, the pole snapped in half with a loud crack. I barely had time to react before the pieces of the rod flew from my hands, the line still taut and stretching impossibly far out into the water. My heart hammered in my chest, a rush of adrenaline making my legs feel weak. I stumbled backward, half expecting whatever had pulled the line to surface something monstrous, something that didn't belong. But there was nothing. The lake sat undisturbed, its surface calm once more. My heart still raced, and my breath came in shallow bursts as I stared at the broken rod in my hands. For a moment I considered leaving, packing up and driving far away from that eerie, silent dock. But the curiosity gnawed at me, and against my better judgment, I found myself standing at the edge of the dock, peering into the water, waiting for something to break the surface. I stood there for what felt like hours, the cool breeze from the lake brushing against my skin. But nothing happened. The sun sank lower, painting the sky with streaks of orange and purple. I almost convinced myself that it had all been a fluke, that maybe I had just been caught by an unusually strong fish. And then I saw it. A shape moving just beneath the water. It wasn't the flash of a fish or the ripple of a turtle. It was something large, something that could only be described as unnatural. The shape was dark, elongated, and it shifted through the water with a strange grace, as if it were aware of my presence. I felt my breath catch in my throat as I leaned forward, trying to make out what it was, but the shadows beneath the water distorted the image. I knew I should have run, should have packed up and left, but something about the sight pulled me in, rooted me to the spot. The shape moved again, this time closer to the dock, its movement slow and deliberate. My mind screamed at me to turn away, but I couldn't. I just stood there, frozen, staring into the depths. The line that had snapped earlier now floated in the water, drifting slowly toward the edge of the dock. I reached down to pull it back in, but as my fingers brushed the surface of the water, I felt it. A coldness that was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It wasn't the cool touch of lake water, it was something deeper, something ancient and unforgiving. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I recoiled, pulling my hand back as if I had touched something alive. That was when I heard the sound. A soft scraping noise like claws dragging across the bottom of the lake. The sound was faint at first, but it grew louder, closer. It came from directly beneath the dock, from the very depths I had been staring into. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding, my legs trembling. And then, as if to confirm my worst fear, a dark shape broke the surface of the water, large and hulking, its form monstrous. A long, slimy appendage reached up, brushing against the underside of the dock with a sickening scrape. My breath caught in my throat as I stared, unable to tear my eyes away from the water. Whatever it wasn't a fish. It wasn't even an animal. It was something else entirely. The shape below the water shifted, as if aware of my presence, and the claw-like appendage retracted back beneath the surface with a slow, deliberate motion. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe as I watched the water slowly settle once more. I ran. I didn't look back. My legs burned as I sprinted up the overgrown path, my mind reeling with what I had just seen. The dock, the water, the claw, they all felt like a dream, like something I could forget if I just put enough distance between myself and it. But the memory lingered, burning in my mind. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me from the water. The image of the dark shape beneath the surface haunted me, and I knew no matter how much I tried to deny it that the dock had kept its secret. Something was down there, and it wasn't finished with me yet. Story 13. The old motel was tucked away on the edge of a sleepy town, its neon sign flickering in the late evening light. I'd been driving for hours, the road stretching endlessly ahead, and I was eager to find a place to rest. The motel seemed empty, almost abandoned, with peeling paint on the walls and a faint musty smell in the air. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with a tired smile, handed me a key without a word, and I made my way to the room at the end of the hall. Inside, the room was dimly lit by the soft glow of a single lamp, the air thick with the scent of stale smoke and old furniture. The bed was covered in a faded quilt, and the carpet was worn thin, as if countless travelers had come and gone over the years. I tossed my bag onto the bed and sat down, letting out a sigh of relief. The only sound in the room was the low hum of the refrigerator in the corner, struggling to keep cool. I switched on the TV to drown out the silence, the static flickering on the screen as it warmed up. The motel's channel was grainy, a mix of old commercials and low-budget infomercials. I had no intention of watching for long, just enough to relax before heading to bed. But as I flipped through the channels, something strange happened. The screen flickered again, and then the picture cleared, only it wasn't showing what I expected. It was my room. The TV displayed a perfect view of the bed, the door, and the small nightstand beside it. The angle was off, though, as if someone were filming from the corner of the room I couldn't see. My stomach tightened, and I sat up straighter, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I had locked the door when I entered, and no one else had come in. I reached for the remote, intending to change the channel, but it didn't work. The TV stayed fixed on the footage of my room. The image was grainy, much like the rest of the broadcast, but it was unmistakably my space. I could see my bag on the bed, the small lamp next to it casting a faint glow, just as it was in the room. But there was no one there. For a moment, I thought it was some kind of prank, maybe a hidden camera or a security feature of the motel. But when I glanced around the room again, nothing had changed. I was still alone. I stood up, my pulse quickening, and walked over to the TV, pressing the buttons on the remote again. It still refused to change, the image of my room remaining frozen on the screen. Then, as if on cue, the footage shifted. The camera angle moved slightly, showing a view of the corner where the dresser sat. The bed was no longer empty. A figure was lying on it. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no one else in the room, but the figure on the screen was clearly visible, a vague shape under the blanket, obscured by the poor quality of the footage. I backed away from the TV, my breath shallow and quick. The room felt colder now, the air heavy with something I couldn't place. I turned on the light, but it didn't help. The sense of dread continued to grow. What was this? Who had set up a camera in my room? My mind raced through possibilities, but none of them made sense. Suddenly, the figure on the bed shifted. The blanket rustled as if someone had just moved beneath it. I spun around, half expecting to see someone standing behind me, but there was nothing. My eyes snapped back to the TV. The figure was still there, and now it was sitting up slowly. The blurry outline of its head turned toward the camera. I felt my legs weaken, and I stumbled back, my hands reaching for the phone on the nightstand. I dialed the front desk, my voice shaking as I explained what was happening. The receptionist answered, her voice tired but calm. "There's no one else in your room, sir. You're the only guest tonight." I didn't know how to respond to that. I wanted to scream, to demand that she come to my room, but the words stuck in my throat. The figure on the screen stood up now, moving slowly as though it were just getting out of bed. I backed away from the TV, my eyes never leaving the screen. The camera angle shifted again. this time showing the door to the room, just beyond the figure. The door was slightly ajar. I hadn't left it like that. I had locked it. I felt trapped, like a fly caught in a web. The figure on the TV moved toward the door, the camera angle following it as it reached the entrance. My breath hitched as it pushed the door open, the handle turning slowly, deliberately. Then, the figure stepped into the hallway, and the screen went black. The silence that followed was deafening. I stood there frozen, not sure what to do next. My heart was pounding in my chest, the fear crawling under my skin. I grabbed my bag, ready to leave, but as I reached for the door, the TV flickered back to life. This time, the screen showed a different angle, one from outside the room. The camera was pointed toward the hallway, showing the dimly lit corridor stretching in both directions. And then, to my horror, I saw the figure. It was standing outside my door. The figure's face was still obscured, but it was clearly watching my room. I could feel the weight of its gaze even through the screen. I stumbled backward, falling to the floor, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my bag and ran out of the room, down the hallway, and toward the exit. My footsteps echoed in the empty motel, but there was no one else in sight. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. I glanced up at the motel one last time, my hands shaking as I started the engine. The light in my room was still on, casting a faint glow against the dark motel exterior. But the TV had stopped playing. It was silent now. Story 14. The old library stood at the corner of Maple Street, a place steeped in history and surrounded by an air of mystery. It was the kind of place where time seemed to slow down, where the musty scent of old paper and leather bindings filled the air. When I saw the ad for the night shift, I couldn't resist. It promised quiet, solitude, and a chance to immerse myself in a world of books. I had always loved the idea of working in a place so steeped in history, and it seemed like the perfect escape from the noise of the outside world. The first few nights were calm, just as I had imagined. The library was deserted, and the only sound was the rustle of pages as I flipped through books for my own amusement or to make sure everything was in order. The lights hummed overhead, casting long shadows between the rows of towering bookshelves. I took my time, enjoying the peaceful rhythm of the quiet library. But as the days passed, I began to notice strange things happening. One evening, as I was shelving a collection of vintage novels, I turned to reach for the next stack of books and heard a soft rustling noise behind me. I looked up, but there was no one there. At first, I brushed it off as a draft or perhaps my imagination playing tricks. But as the night wore on, I kept hearing it. A soft rustling, like pages turning, or perhaps books being shifted. I dismissed the idea at first. The library was old, there were bound to be creaks and groans from the settling wood and shifting shelves. But then I noticed something. The books had moved. A row that I had just carefully arranged was now slightly askew. The titles, which had been in alphabetical order, were now out of place. I straightened them again, chalking it up to an error I might have made. The next night, it happened again. I was at the front desk, sorting through some return slips, when I heard the unmistakable sound of books moving behind me. I turned around quickly, heart racing, and saw that several books on the shelf near the fiction section had been rearranged. The rows were no longer in perfect order. Someone or something had been moving them. I went over to the shelf and began rearranging them again, my hands trembling as I straightened each one. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, but a creeping sense of unease had begun to settle over me. This wasn't just about books moving. It felt like the library was trying to communicate something, to send a message. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that there was something in the shadows, something that lingered when I wasn't paying attention. The nights grew longer, and the rearranging continued. Every time I turned my back, the books shifted. Sometimes it was only a few titles, other times entire shelves. It was always subtle, just enough to make me question whether I had placed them there in the first place. I began to mark the rows with a pencil, but even then, the books would move, as if they had a mind of their own. One evening, as I walked past the history section, I noticed something strange. A book had fallen to the floor. I bent down to pick it up, but as soon as I touched it, I felt an icy chill run up my spine. The title on the cover was familiar, The Forgotten Tales of Maple Street. I had seen it earlier in the week, but I was certain I had placed it back on the shelf. It wasn't even the kind of book one would have read, yet there it was, face up, as if it had been waiting for me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, but I forced myself to ignore it. I put the book back on the shelf, but as I did, I saw something else. The titles on the shelf in front of me had moved again, but this time one of the books was turned in the opposite direction. My fingers tightened around the edge of the shelf as a shiver of fear crept down my spine. By now, I was convinced something was wrong. There was no logical explanation for what was happening. I tried to talk myself out of it, but the unease continued to build. The books weren't just moving, they were trying to tell me something. I was sure of it. Late one night, after a particularly unsettling incident where I caught a glimpse of a shadow moving out of the corner of my eye, I decided to investigate. I went down to the basement of the library, where the oldest books were stored, hoping to find an explanation for the strange occurrences. The basement was damp, with low ceilings and narrow aisles. The shelves here were filled with dust and forgotten volumes. As I wandered deeper into the shadows, I came across an old, leather-bound journal. The cover was cracked, but the pages inside were surprisingly intact. I opened it, and my breath caught. The first page read, "The books are not just words. They are memories. They are alive." The writing was shaky, as if the person who wrote it had been desperate to communicate something. I flipped through the pages, each one filled with cryptic entries about the history of the library, about books that moved of their own accord, and about the strange energy that seemed to reside in the walls. As I read, I realized that the library had a history of strange occurrences, much older than I had imagined. The books were more than just paper and ink, they were vessels, holding something intangible, something powerful. The library itself seemed to be alive, and it had been for decades, perhaps longer. The whispers in the shadows, the shifting of the books, it all made sense now. That night, as I returned to the main floor, I felt a shift in the air. The whispering rustle of pages surrounded me, more intense than ever. I looked at the rows of books, and for the first time, I realized they were watching me. The arrangement of the books wasn't random, it was deliberate. I had become part of something larger, something ancient. The library had chosen me, and now I was bound to it, just like the books I had cared for. The rearranging didn't stop. It continued every night, but now I no longer questioned it. I accepted it as part of the library's strange rhythm, knowing that the books had their own agenda. I had become a part of their world, a world where the line between the living and the dead blurred, where the pages of the past whispered their secrets to anyone willing to listen. Story 15. The funeral home sat at the edge of town, its grand facade slowly crumbling into decay. A thick layer of dust coated the windows, and the faint scent of mildew hung in the air. For years, rumors had circulated about the place, whispers of strange happenings and unexplained disappearances. Today, curiosity outweighed caution as I approached the front door, my heart racing with the thrill of exploring something long forgotten. I pushed the door open, the hinges creaking in protest. The interior was shrouded in darkness, save for the dim light filtering through the grime on the windows. A cold draft blew through the empty hallway, stirring the remnants of old funeral decorations that had once adorned the walls. It felt as though time had come to a standstill here, as if no one had stepped inside for decades. The air was thick with dust, the silence only broken by the occasional scurrying of rats in the corners. I slowly made my way through the foyer, the worn floorboards creaking beneath my feet. The hall led to several rooms, some still holding remnants of old furniture, others completely barren. The further I ventured, the more uneasy I became. At the end of the hall, I found the showroom. It was an enormous room, with high ceilings and large windows, now clouded with years of neglect. Row after row of caskets lined the walls, some opened, others still sealed shut, as if they were waiting for their final occupant. The air was suffocatingly still, each casket an eerie reminder of the place's past purpose. But one casket stood out from the rest. It was placed in the center of the room, gleaming under the weak light that filtered in through the windows. It was pristine, untouched by time, its dark wood shining as if it had been polished only hours before. What caught my attention, however, was the lock. A heavy iron clasp sealed it shut, an unusual feature for a casket that seemed otherwise untouched by age. I couldn't resist the urge to investigate. My fingers brushed over the cold metal lock, and I leaned in closer to inspect it. The lock was old, rusted in places, but it held firm. What troubled me was that the lock wasn't just on the outside, it seemed to be locking something from the inside, as if someone or something was trapped inside. A chill ran down my spine, but my curiosity pushed me forward. I checked the other caskets, but none of them seemed as peculiar. They were empty or in disrepair, but none were locked in the same way. The showroom felt cold, too cold, and the longer I stood there, the more uncomfortable I became. I could hear the soft scratching of rats in the corners, their tiny claws scraping against the floor. But the silence in the room was otherwise overwhelming. I placed my ear against the casket, my breath shallow. For a moment I could have sworn I heard something, a faint, muffled sound coming from inside. It wasn't clear at first, but it sounded like breathing. I stepped back, my mind racing. Could someone still be inside? Had someone been left here, forgotten by the world outside? I fought the rising panic in my chest, reminding myself that I was just letting my imagination run wild. This place had been abandoned for years, there was no way anyone could still be here. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The quiet, oppressive atmosphere of the room seemed to close in around me. The walls, once adorned with tasteful funeral decorations, now felt like they were watching me, closing in with every passing second. The air grew thicker, the weight of the silence pressing on my chest. I stood there frozen, for what felt like an eternity. The faint scratching of rats had stopped, and the room had grown even quieter. It felt as though the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. My hands were clammy, my heart pounding in my ears. Without thinking, I reached for the lock again. This time I twisted the rusted clasp, my fingers trembling as I tried to undo it. It gave with a sharp click, the sound echoing in the stillness of the room. For a moment, nothing happened. The casket remained still, unyielding, as if it were daring me to open it. I hesitated. My mind screamed at me to run, to leave this place and never look back. But the pull of curiosity, the desire to know what lay inside, was too strong. I slowly lifted the lid, the hinges groaning with the effort. The casket creaked open, revealing a dark interior, but as the lid swung wide, I froze. Inside was a body, or at least what looked like one. It was pale, lifeless, dressed in a dark suit, its face covered by a thin veil. But what made my stomach churn wasn't the body itself, it was the fact that the figure inside was still moving. It wasn't breathing in the normal sense. The movements were slow, deliberate, like something trying to claw its way out from within. The body twitched, the fingers scraping at the velvet lining of the casket, as if it were desperate to break free. I stumbled back, my heart racing, my breath catching in my throat. The figure inside the casket twitched again, its hand slamming against the wood. The muffled sound from before, the one I had mistaken for breathing, became clearer, raspy, gurgling noise that seemed to come from deep within the body. Suddenly, the air around me turned frigid. The temperature plummeted, the room growing unbearably cold as the lights flickered and buzzed. I could feel the presence of something alive, yet not. A whisper of a voice, barely audible, floated through the air, as if the dead figure was trying to speak. My feet carried me backward without thought, each step driven by terror. The casket slammed shut with a deafening bang, the noise echoing through the funeral home. The lights flickered one last time before plunging the room into darkness. I didn't stop running until I was outside, the cold night air filling my lungs. The funeral home loomed behind me, its silhouette dark against the starless sky. My mind raced as I looked back, half expecting to see something or someone watching me from the windows. But there was nothing. I didn't go back inside. I didn't even look back as I drove away, leaving the old funeral home behind. But the memory of what I had seen, the movement inside that locked casket, stayed with me. And I knew, deep down, that the place had been waiting for someone to unlock it. Story 16. The diner was small and unassuming, tucked between two dilapidated gas stations on a stretch of highway that seemed to go on forever. It was the kind of place you stop at when you're exhausted, looking for a quick bite and a break from the endless road. The neon sign flickered overhead, buzzing softly in the evening air, casting a sickly glow over the parking lot. The familiar smell of grease and coffee hit me as I pushed the door open, the bell above the door chiming faintly. Inside, the diner was quieter than I expected for a late afternoon. The booths were filled with a few scattered patrons, their faces illuminated by the warm yellow light that hung overhead. I glanced around for a seat, and my eyes immediately landed on the corner booth. An older man sat there, his back hunched, his fingers wrapped around a coffee cup. His face looked familiar, but I couldn't quite place him. He glanced up at me for a moment, offering a half-hearted smile before returning to his coffee. I slid into a booth near the window, the cracked vinyl squeaking as I settled in. The waitress, a woman with short, frizzy hair and an apron that seemed too big for her frame, came over. "What can I get you?" she asked in a voice that sounded like she had repeated the question 1,000 times before. I ordered a burger and a cup of coffee, trying to shake off the strange feeling gnawing at me. It wasn't just the man in the corner booth that unsettled me, it was the whole place. The other patrons, the ones scattered around the diner, all looked eerily familiar. They each had the same face, the same features, but in a different context. Like they were all people from my past, yet none of them were exactly right. I noticed the woman at the counter next. She had long, dark hair and wore a faded sweater, her back hunched over a plate of fries. She looked exactly like my old college roommate, Sarah, the one who had left school halfway through our senior year and never contacted me again. She turned her head slightly, and for a brief moment, our eyes met. But she didn't smile, didn't even acknowledge me. She just returned to her meal, eating in silence. My pulse quickened. I shifted in my seat, looking around at the other faces. The man in the booth looked like my father when he was younger, right before he had stopped talking to me all those years ago. The couple sitting by the window, they were like my aunt and uncle, the ones who had disappeared without a trace when I was a child. Even the waitress had a vague resemblance to my childhood neighbor, the one who had moved away without saying goodbye. I told myself it was just a strange coincidence. Maybe it was the fatigue from too many hours behind the wheel. I rubbed my eyes, trying to clear the fog in my head. The waitress returned with my coffee, setting it down with a faint smile. I thanked her, but she didn't respond. She just walked away without another word. I took a sip of the coffee, hoping the warmth would settle my nerves. But the unease only grew stronger. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was in some kind of bizarre dream, where everyone I encountered was a version of someone I used to know. But how could that be? How could they all be here? The more I looked around, the more I realized that none of these people were behaving like themselves. The woman who looked like Sarah wasn't eating her fries. She was staring blankly at the plate, her hand resting motionless beside her. The man who looked like my father had stopped drinking his coffee. His hand was wrapped tightly around the cup, his knuckles white, and his eyes stared ahead in an unnerving, glassy gaze. The couple that resembled my aunt and uncle had their heads down, their lips moving in slow, silent conversation. No sound came from their table. I felt a tightening in my chest, an irrational panic creeping up my spine. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I glanced toward the door, half expecting someone to walk in and break the strange spell that seemed to have descended on the diner. But no one came. It was then that I noticed something even more unsettling. The clock on the wall was stuck at exactly 3:15. I had been in the diner for nearly an hour, but the time hadn't moved an inch. My heart began to race. I wasn't sure what was happening, but I knew I needed to leave. I stood up abruptly, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. The movement seemed to snap everyone in the diner out of their trance, their heads slowly turning toward me. The woman who looked like Sarah's lips parted slightly, and for the first time since I entered, I saw her eyes flicker with recognition. But instead of greeting me or even smiling, her face twisted into a strange, almost sorrowful expression. Her mouth opened as if to say something, but no sound came out. She simply stared at me, her eyes wide with a mix of confusion and despair. I didn't wait around to see what would happen next. I grabbed my jacket and rushed for the door, not daring to look back. As I stepped outside, the cold air hit my face, and I gulped down a breath of fresh air, trying to steady my nerves. The bell above the door rang as I exited, and I hesitated, glancing through the window one last time. The diner looked unchanged, the patrons still sitting there in their unnerving stillness. But as I turned to walk away, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the window, and for a split second, I saw myself sitting in one of the booths, staring back at me with the same empty expression on my face. I didn't stick around to figure out what it meant. I got into my car and drove off, the hum of the engine a steady rhythm in the quiet night. But no matter how far I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me from that diner, something I couldn't escape. Story 17. The sun hung low behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the rugged terrain. I had been hiking for hours, the steady rhythm of my boots crunching against the dirt path a comforting sound in the otherwise still wilderness. The air was crisp, and the scent of pine mixed with the faint smell of earth and moss. I had taken this hike to clear my mind, escaping the noise of the world. But as I rounded a bend in the trail, something caught my eye. There, half hidden by overgrown shrubs, was an old shack. It looked abandoned, with its wooden walls cracked and splintered, and the roof sagging in places. It didn't belong here, tucked away so far from civilization. I hesitated for a moment, but my curiosity got the better of me. I carefully stepped off the trail, pushing through the dense underbrush until I reached the shack. The door was slightly ajar, creaking as it swayed in the wind. I paused again, listening to the silence around me. There was no sound, no movement, not even the distant rustle of wildlife. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open, stepping inside. The dim light filtered through cracks in the walls, illuminating the dusty interior. Old wooden furniture lay in disarray, shelves filled with broken tools, an overturned chair, and a table covered in what appeared to be old maps and papers. I moved further into the room, the floorboards groaning underfoot. The air was musty, thick with the smell of mildew and age. But what stood out more than the decay was the faint but unmistakable smell of fresh ink. My gaze shifted to the small table in the corner, where a folded piece of paper lay. It looked new, its edges crisp and clean compared to the other debris scattered around the room. My heart skipped a beat as I reached for it, unfolding the paper slowly. The writing was neat, the letters sharp and precise, as if someone had just written it. Turn around now. Now. The words hit me like a cold wave, and for a moment I froze. A sense of unease washed over me, a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. I glanced around the room, my eyes scanning the shadowed corners as if expecting someone to emerge from the dark. But the shack was empty. I read the note again, feeling the weight of its message press down on me. Who had left it here? Why? The logical part of my mind told me it was probably just a prank, some kind of twisted joke. But then again, why would anyone leave a note in an abandoned shack miles away from the nearest trail? I stuffed the note into my pocket, my fingers trembling slightly. I turned toward the door, feeling the oppressive silence press in from all sides. My instincts were screaming at me to leave, to get as far away from this place as possible. But the trail was still ahead of me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was drawing me further into the mountains. I took one last glance around the room before stepping back outside, my breath coming out in visible puffs in the cold air. The shack looked even more unsettling in the fading light, as if it were somehow watching me. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to focus on the path ahead. But as I took my first step, I heard something footsteps behind me, faint but unmistakable. My heart skipped a beat, and I spun around, but there was nothing. Just the empty shack, the darkened woods, and a whisper of wind through the trees. I shook my head, trying to calm myself. My mind was playing tricks on me. There was no one here. No one had followed me up the mountain. But the footsteps were real. I was sure of it. I took another step, then another, each one a little faster than the last. My legs carried me down the mountain path, my eyes darting over my shoulder every few moments. I couldn't explain why, but the hair on the back of my neck was standing up. I felt like I was being watched, like something was lurking just out of sight. The sky had turned a deeper shade of purple by the time I reached the point where the trail split, one path leading back to the main trailhead and the other winding deeper into the mountains. I didn't even think, I just kept walking, choosing the familiar path, the one I knew would lead me back to my car. But as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air felt heavier now, thick with an oppressive stillness. There was no sound of birds or insects, no distant rustling of animals in the underbrush, just the occasional snap of a twig beneath my boots. I checked my phone, but there was no signal. Not that I had expected one, but the lack of connection only added to the unsettling atmosphere. I forced myself to keep moving, not looking back, not slowing down. The note, the footsteps, the silent pressure that seemed to weigh on my chest, it all felt like too much. Then, just as I reached the edge of the trail, I heard it again, the faintest sound of footsteps, this time much closer. I stopped in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. I turned, and there, standing at the end of the path where the woods began to thicken, was a figure. A man. He stood completely still, his face hidden in the shadows, his body outlined against the darkening sky. I couldn't make out his features, but I could feel his gaze on me, heavy and intent. I felt my legs freeze, my body paralyzed with fear. Then, without a word, he turned and disappeared into the woods, as quietly as he had come. The silence returned, but now it felt different, darker, more foreboding. I didn't wait to see if he would come back. My feet moved of their own accord, carrying me down the mountain trail at a sprint, the sound of my heart pounding in my ears. I didn't stop until I reached my car, the headlights cutting through the darkness like a beacon of safety. I slammed the door shut, locking it before I even had time to think. I stared out at the dark mountains, my mind racing. And then I remembered the note. The message was still in my pocket, crumpled but intact. I pulled it out and read the words once more. Turn around now. But this time I didn't need the note to tell me. I had already turned around. Story 18. I had been driving for hours through winding country roads, the kind where the trees seemed to stretch endlessly and the world felt far away. The bed and breakfast I'd booked was located in a small village that didn't even appear on most maps. After what felt like an eternity, I finally spotted a wooden sign with the name Willow's Rest painted on it. The house was charming, an old Victorian that seemed as though it had been frozen in time. Ivy crawled up the sides of the building, and a heavy fog rolled through the yard, giving the place an eerie, dreamlike quality. I pulled into the gravel driveway and parked next to an old stone fountain, the sound of water trickling softly in the background. The door opened as soon as I approached, and a woman appeared in the doorway. She was in her mid-50s, with sharp features and an intense gaze that immediately made me feel like she was sizing me up. "Welcome," she said, her voice low but warm. "You must be the one from the reservation." Her name was Clara, and she led me inside with a quick, brisk walk like someone with a very specific routine. The interior of the bed and breakfast was decorated in faded wallpaper, floral rugs, and old paintings that seemed to stare down at me as I passed. There was an odd stillness to the place, as if the world outside had stopped moving while this house continued in its own forgotten rhythm. Clara handed me a worn, antique key and told me my room was on the second floor. As I turned to head upstairs, she suddenly stopped me. "One moment," she said, her eyes flicking to a small, vintage camera on the nearby table. "I just need to take your photo for the guest book." I hesitated. "A photo?" I asked, my voice unsure. "Yes," Clara replied, already holding the camera up. "It's tradition here. All the guests get their picture taken. It's for our records. You don't mind, do you?" I opened my mouth to protest, but something in her gaze made me pause. Her expression was unreadable, almost too calm. "It's just a photo," she added, her smile too quick, too forced. "Then you can go up and settle in." Feeling uncomfortable but not wanting to seem rude, I nodded and allowed her to take the picture. The flash went off, and I felt an inexplicable chill run through me. "Thank you," Clara said, lowering the camera and quickly tucking it back on the shelf. "I'll show you to your room now." The room itself was exactly what I had expected: a quaint, old-fashioned space with a heavy four-poster bed, lace curtains, and a view of the foggy garden. But despite the charm, there was something about the room that made me uneasy. The air felt thick, and the smell of old wood and lavender mixed in a way that didn't sit right with me. I sat on the bed for a while, unpacking my things, but the unease continued to grow. The photo Clara had taken kept replaying in my mind. Why did she insist on taking it? It wasn't like I'd stayed at 100 bed and breakfast before, but I'd never encountered a host who was so insistent. The rest of the evening was quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I decided to go downstairs to stretch my legs and get some fresh air. The hallway was eerily still, and as I passed by the staircase, I thought I heard something faint like soft whispers coming from below. I stopped, my hand gripping the railing. Was I imagining things? I shook my head and walked on, stepping carefully down the stairs. The house seemed even quieter than before, the silence pressing in around me. Clara was sitting in a small lounge area near the front door reading a book. She looked up as I entered, her eyes locking onto mine with a sharpness that sent a chill through me. "Hey, can I get you anything?" she asked, her voice suddenly too soft, too smooth. "I'm just stretching my legs," I replied, trying to sound casual. "It's a lovely place you have here." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Thank you. It's been in my family for generations. We've always made sure to keep it preserved, so that the past stays alive." I nodded, though her words struck me as odd. "That's a nice thought." Clara stood, placing her book down. "It is. And I like to think that all the guests who come here leave a little piece of themselves behind. It's part of the tradition." I couldn't help but ask, "What do you mean by that?" She smiled again, the same tight-lipped grin. "Nothing to worry about. Just a little something that makes Willow's Rest special." A little too special, I thought. After a few more moments of awkward silence, I decided to head back to my room. "Thank you, Clara. I think I'll turn in for the night." Her gaze followed me as I left, her silence more unnerving than any words. I quickly made my way back upstairs and locked the door behind me. As I undressed for bed, I glanced at the old portrait above the nightstand. It depicted a woman who looked almost exactly like Clara, only she was younger and her expression was colder, more distant. I shivered and pulled the covers up around me. The silence in the house pressed down harder, the kind of silence that feels like a presence. I tried to ignore it, closing my eyes and willing myself to sleep. But sleep didn't come easily. Sometime after midnight, I was jolted awake by a loud thud from downstairs. I lay frozen, listening. Another thud, followed by a series of muffled sounds. It was impossible to ignore now. My curiosity got the better of me, and I carefully crept out of bed, slipping into my shoes. I tiptoed down the hallway, reaching the top of the stairs. The noises were clearer now, footsteps, dragging, faint but unmistakable. I slowly descended, trying to make no sound. At the bottom of the stairs, I saw Clara standing by the front door. She was staring down at something in her hands. It was a photo album, and I could see my own face staring back at me from the open page. My stomach lurched. The room felt colder, and the silence returned, suffocating. Clara didn't look up. She just kept turning the pages, her fingers gently brushing over each photo. I couldn't breathe. Suddenly, she looked up, her eyes meeting mine with an eerie calmness. "You should be in the guest book now," she said, her voice soft and distant. "We always keep our guests with us." I turned and ran. I didn't stop until I was out the door, never looking back. Story 19. The historic district of the city had always intrigued me. The cobblestone streets, the old brick buildings with faded facades, and the quiet charm that clung to every corner made it feel like a step back in time. I spent most of my afternoons wandering through these streets, admiring the architecture and imagining the lives that once unfolded behind those worn doors and windows. On that particular day, the sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the buildings. The air was cool, carrying a hint of autumn in its crispness. I meandered down a narrow alley, a part of the district I hadn't explored in a while, my boots clicking softly against the cobblestones. It was then that I noticed an old wooden door, ajar, standing at the base of a narrow, unremarkable building. The door was weathered, its paint chipped and peeling, and yet there was something about it that caught my attention. It looked out of place, as though it had been forgotten by time but was still stubbornly holding on to its existence. I paused for a moment, curiosity piqued. No one else seemed to be around, the street empty except for a few distant voices. The door, though slightly open, didn't give away much about what was inside. It was odd, why would such an old door be left open in the middle of the day? I stepped closer, instinctively drawn toward it. The threshold was just wide enough for me to slip through, and the dim interior beyond was cloaked in shadows. I hesitated for a second, wondering if I should enter. The thought of exploring a forgotten space in this historic district was too tempting to ignore. I leaned forward, peeking inside. My eyes tried to adjust to the gloom, but I could barely make out anything. Then, as the light shifted just right, I saw what was inside. There was no room, no furniture, no objects, just a solid brick wall. I blinked, unsure if I was seeing things clearly. The door had been standing open, inviting me in, yet all I could see beyond it was a smooth, unbroken wall of red brick. No windows, no doorways, nothing. I stepped back in confusion, thinking I had misjudged the angle, or perhaps there was something more to this that I hadn't noticed. But no, when I looked again, the brick wall was still there, perfectly ordinary in appearance. I reached out, cautiously, to touch the edge of the doorframe, expecting to feel the cool wood or perhaps the remnants of an old rug that might have once been in the entryway. Instead, my fingers brushed against the rough texture of the brick wall itself. It felt real solid, unyielding. I pulled my hand away and stepped back further, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It didn't make sense. How could a door lead to a wall? I glanced up and down the street, as if expecting someone to appear and explain the strange sight I had just witnessed. But the street was empty, the world beyond this peculiar door unchanged. A wave of unease crept up my spine. I took a deep breath, then stepped closer again, peering through the gap in the door. There was no trick of light, no optical illusion, just a brick wall. The door, however, seemed to insist that there was more, that there should be more. My mind raced with possibilities. Was this some kind of hidden space? A long-forgotten room bricked up for reasons unknown? Perhaps it had once been an office or a storeroom, sealed off by whoever owned the building long ago. The more I thought about it, the more unsettling the whole situation became. I reached for the door handle, almost instinctively. It was cold under my fingers, the metal tarnished and smooth from years of use. I hesitated, unsure if I should push further. But the door was open, and it felt like something was urging me to take the next step, to go beyond the door and into whatever lay beyond that wall. As my hand gripped the knob, I felt a strange pressure in the air around me, like the space between me and the door had thickened, become heavier. My chest tightened, and a subtle chill crept down my spine. The feeling was like being on the edge of something, a discovery, perhaps, or a warning. I turned the handle slowly, the creaking sound of the door's hinges echoing in the quiet alley. The wall beyond remained unchanged, but as the door swung further open, I realized that the gap seemed to stretch wider than it had before. It was as if the space between the door frame and the wall was growing, shifting. I froze. The air felt unnervingly still, and for a moment I wondered if I was imagining the entire scene. My heart pounded in my chest, and a knot of dread tightened in my stomach. Was this place haunted, or was I simply chasing some strange trick of the mind? I stepped back again, the door swinging gently shut behind me. The unease that had settled over me remained, heavy and suffocating. I glanced around once more, searching for some sort of explanation, but nothing made sense. The building was old, but so were many others in the district. There was nothing extraordinary about it, nothing that should have made this particular door seem so wrong. I took a few steps away from the entrance, still unsure of what had just happened. My curiosity nagged at me, urging me to return, to figure out the mystery behind that door. But there was a growing certainty inside me that I wasn't supposed to enter. Something about that space felt incomplete, like the brick wall was hiding something, or maybe it was a warning. I walked away slowly, my eyes lingering on the door one last time as I passed. The building stood silent, its weathered facade unchanged. The streets of the district continued on as they always had, unaffected by the strange encounter. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just stumbled upon something far older, far stranger than I could understand. And somewhere, deep inside me, I knew that I'd never truly be able to forget the open door that led to nothing at all. Story 20. The mansion sat at the edge of town, a crumbling relic from a bygone era. Its walls, once grand and imposing, now sagged with the weight of time. The owner, Mr. Harrow, was an elderly man who lived alone, save for a series of long-forgotten staff members who had all left over the years. I was hired on as the caretaker, a position that promised quiet work in exchange for room and board. But from the moment I stepped inside, something about the mansion felt wrong. The first few days went smoothly enough. I spent my time cleaning the dusty, neglected rooms, scrubbing away years of grime and decay. The house, despite its age, held a certain charm: Gothic arches, polished wood floors, and faded tapestries that whispered of a time long past. Mr. Harrow hardly spoke to me except when he asked me to complete a task. He was polite but distant, as if my presence was merely an inconvenience. One evening, after finishing my chores, I noticed a door in the far corner of the mansion's hallway. It was small, unremarkable, and covered in shadows. I hadn't seen it before. My curiosity piqued. I approached it, but as I drew closer, I saw something that made my breath catch. Thick chains wrapped around the door, fastened tightly with a large rusted padlock. The sight of it sent an icy chill down my spine. I had spent days exploring every inch of the mansion, but this door had eluded me until now. I knocked lightly, half expecting Mr. Harrow to appear and tell me to leave it alone, but no one came. I leaned closer, my fingers grazing the cool metal of the chains. The door seemed to hold something, or someone on the other side. A low, muffled sound drifted from beneath it, soft and unintelligible. My heart rate quickened as I pulled away, unsure of what to make of the noise. That night, over dinner, I tried to bring up the door casually. "Mr. Harrow," I started, my voice faltering. "I noticed there's a door at the end of the hallway, the one with the chains on it. What's behind it?" I watched his face closely, hoping for some explanation, but his expression immediately hardened. He didn't answer me right away, his hands trembling slightly as he pushed his plate aside. Finally, he spoke, his voice cold. "That door's not for you to worry about. Stay away from it." The sudden harshness in his tone surprised me, and I instinctively nodded, not daring to push further. But that night I couldn't stop thinking about it. What could be so important, so dangerous, that it needed to be locked away like that? My mind raced with possibilities: hidden treasure, dark secrets, or something far worse. The sound I had heard, what was it? My curiosity gnawed at me, and I knew I wouldn't be able to ignore the door for long. Days passed, and the strange pull toward the locked basement door only grew stronger. I tried to busy myself with other tasks: polishing the silverware, tending to the overgrown garden, scrubbing the kitchen floors, but my thoughts kept drifting back to that door. Every creak of the house at night, every gust of wind rattling the windows, felt like a whisper, urging me to discover what lay hidden below. Then, one evening, as the sun set behind the mansion, I heard something new: loud, distinct footsteps coming from beneath the floorboards. It was impossible I was alone in the house. My heart began to race as I stood at the foot of the stairs, straining my ears to catch the sound again. It was as if someone was walking in the basement, pacing back and forth. My hands trembled as I approached the door. I reached for the chains, feeling the cold metal under my fingertips. Without thinking, I knelt down and began trying to undo the padlock. The chains rattled as I worked, and I could feel my pulse in my ears, the tension building with every second. The noise from below grew louder, more frantic, almost as if whoever or whatever was down there knew what I was doing. With one final twist, the lock gave way, and the chains fell to the floor with a heavy thud. The door creaked open with an eerie, drawn-out groan. I hesitated for a moment, but then, driven by an overwhelming urge, I stepped into the dark, narrow staircase that led down into the basement. The air was thick, stale, and smelled of damp earth and mildew. Each step felt heavier than the last, the silence around me growing more oppressive. The only sound was the distant, echoing footsteps that now seemed to be right behind me. The basement was vast, filled with crates and old furniture, piles of forgotten belongings. As I ventured further in, my eyes adjusted to the darkness, and I could make out the faint outline of something at the far end of the room. It was a figure, hunched over, its back to me. My breath caught in my throat as I took another step forward, and the figure turned sharply, revealing a face that made my stomach lurch, a face covered in bruises and twisted in agony. Before I could react, a hand shot out from the shadows, grabbing my arm with a strength I didn't know was possible. I gasped, trying to pull away, but the grip tightened. My heart pounded in my chest as the figure spoke in a low, raspy voice. "You shouldn't have come here." The word sent a jolt of terror through me. I yanked my arm free, stumbling backward, and in the dim light, I saw the true horror of the room. Chains, rusted and worn, lined the walls, some hanging empty while others were still attached to the ground. The floor was stained with dark, dried patches, and in the corner of the room, an old cot lay, its mattress long torn and shredded. I turned and fled, racing up the stairs with every ounce of energy in my body. The footsteps behind me followed, but I couldn't dare to look back. I slammed the basement door shut, quickly bolting the chains back into place. My chest heaved as I tried to steady my breathing, my mind reeling from what I had seen. The next morning, I packed my things. I couldn't stay in that house anymore. I was halfway down the stairs when Mr. Harrow appeared in the hallway. His face was ashen, his eyes dark with something I couldn't place. He didn't need to ask why I was leaving. He knew. "I told you to stay away from that door," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Now you understand." He didn't say anything more as I left, but I could hear the faintest echo of chains rattling behind me as I stepped out of the mansion. The house was silent again, but I knew better than to ever look back. Story 21. The desert stretched out before me, endless and barren, under the vast expanse of the night sky. I had been on a solo camping trip for a few days, searching for a quiet place to clear my head. The stars above were bright, flickering like distant candles, casting a pale light over the sand dunes. The silence was heavy, a calm that felt almost oppressive. I set up my tent near the base of a small ridge, careful to choose a spot that felt right, isolated but not too far from a water source. The sun had just set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, and the air was cooling rapidly. I unpacked my gear, lit a campfire, and began preparing a simple meal. It was then that I first noticed it. Standing on the ridge just beyond the reach of my campfire's light was a figure. At first I thought it was a trick of the light, perhaps a shadow cast by a rock or a tree. But as I stared at it, I realized that it was too distinct to be anything like that. The figure was tall and thin, standing perfectly still, facing in my direction. It was difficult to make out details in the dim light, but I could see that it was human-shaped, broad shoulders, a narrow waist, and limbs that were unnaturally long. It seemed to be watching me, unmoving, despite the cool desert wind that swept across the dunes. I tried not to think too much about it, convincing myself that it was just another person, maybe a hiker or a fellow camper. The desert is vast, after all, and I knew I wasn't the only one who sought its isolation. I turned back to my campfire, attempting to focus on the mundane task of eating, but the feeling that I was being watched persisted. The figure remained in my peripheral vision, unmoving, and I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that crawled up my spine. The wind howled a little louder, but it didn't stir the figure. It just stood there, its outline dark against the fading light. I tried to brush it off, telling myself that it was probably just some illusion brought on by the desert's vastness and my solitude. As the night wore on, the figure didn't budge. I finished my meal, my hands trembling slightly as I ate, my eyes constantly darting back to the ridge. It was impossible to tell if it was a person or something else entirely. But the longer I stared at it, the more I became certain that it wasn't just a trick of the light. I decided to get up and go for a walk to try and clear my mind. But as I stood and took a step toward the ridge, something made me hesitate. My body felt heavy, as though the desert itself was pressing down on me. I glanced back toward the figure and found that it was still standing in the same spot, not even a footstep out of place. A strange thought crept into my mind, one I couldn't shake. What if it wasn't human? The way it stood too still, too rigid, suggested something more than just a lost traveler or fellow camper. But I dismissed the thought quickly, reminding myself that the desert plays tricks on the mind. I was tired, alone, and starting to feel the weight of the wilderness in a way I hadn't before. I settled back down by the campfire, trying to convince myself that I was just imagining things. The fire crackled, and the wind picked up again, sending a chill through the air. Still, the figure stood there, unmoving, as though it were part of the desert itself. Hours passed, the fire burned low, and the moon climbed higher in the sky, casting its silver light across the sands. I checked the figure again. It was still there, its silhouette a darker now against the pale desert night. I couldn't tell if it was watching me or simply existing, but the thought that it might be waiting for something filled me with a deep sense of dread. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the ridge, hoping to get a better look, but the beam of light seemed to dissipate in the vastness of the desert. It didn't reach the figure, and in the distance, it was hard to make out any details. For all I knew, it could have been a shadow cast by a rock or a distant tree, but somehow it didn't feel that way. At that moment, the figure shifted just slightly as though it were settling into place. It wasn't a dramatic movement, just a subtle shift in posture, almost imperceptible, but it made my blood run cold. I felt the urge to run, to pack up and leave, but something about the situation paralyzed me. The hours seemed to stretch into eternity, but eventually the sun began to rise, painting the desert in soft hues of pink and gold. The figure, however, remained where it stood, unmoving, as if it had been there for centuries. It was only when the first rays of daylight touched the ridge that I dared to look away. I packed up my camp in a rush, eager to leave, not wanting to stay another minute. The figure never moved as I prepared to go, and even when I glanced back one last time as I drove off, it was still there, standing on the ridge, watching me. As I drove away, the desert opened up behind me, vast and empty once again, but the memory of the figure remained, burned into my mind like an image I couldn't erase. I told myself it had just been an illusion, a trick of the mind brought on by the isolation. But deep down, I knew that what I had seen was something more, something that the desert had left behind for me to witness and never forget. Story 22. The small cottage sat nestled at the edge of the woods, far enough from town to feel isolated but close enough to be convenient. I had rented it for a weekend getaway, looking to escape the noise and rush of city life. The air was crisp, the scent of pine trees thick around the cottage, and everything felt peaceful. I had spent the first few hours unpacking and settling in, enjoying the quiet and the sense of being alone in nature. The cottage was charming in its simplicity: wooden floors, a small fireplace, and a cozy if somewhat dated interior. I had the place to myself, which was exactly what I wanted. It wasn't luxurious, but it had an old-fashioned charm to it that made me feel like I had stepped back in time. The furniture was mismatched, and the walls were adorned with old, faded photographs that seemed to tell stories of people who had lived there long before me. After settling in, I decided to explore. The kitchen was small but well stocked, and there was a rustic little dining nook by the window. I was about to leave the kitchen when I noticed a small wooden drawer beneath the counter. It was half open, as if someone had left it that way in haste. Curiosity got the better of me, and I pulled it all the way open, expecting to find something mundane, maybe a set of old silverware or forgotten knickknacks. But instead, there was a single cassette tape. It was a simple black tape, the kind you could find in any thrift store. What caught my attention, though, was the label. "Your Voice, 3 a.m." was written in neat, familiar handwriting. My heart skipped a beat. I didn't recognize the handwriting, and I had certainly never left a tape behind. A small wave of unease passed over me, but I quickly brushed it off. After all, it was just an old tape. Someone must have left it behind in the cottage before me. Still, the label stuck in my mind. "Your Voice, 3 a.m." Why would someone label a tape that way? Was it some kind of prank? I decided to play it. The cottage had a small radio with a cassette player, so I popped the tape in, my fingers trembling slightly. The tape clicked and whirred before it started, a soft hiss filling the air. At first, there was nothing but silence. A few seconds passed, and then a voice began to speak. It was my voice. "Hello," I heard myself say, my own voice sounding strange, distant. The recording was from an old-fashioned cassette, its sound grainy and distorted. My breath caught in my throat. I leaned closer to the speaker, the hairs on the back of my neck rising. The voice on the tape continued, but it wasn't from some distant memory. It sounded recent. Too recent. "Is anyone there?" My voice asked again, more urgently this time. I could feel my heart racing, a wave of confusion and panic rising in my chest. This wasn't me speaking now. It was a recording of me, from what sounded like only a few days ago. I hadn't recorded anything like this, had I? The voice on the tape paused for a long, uncomfortable moment. Then it spoke again, this time in a whisper. "I know you're listening." I froze, my blood turning to ice. My fingers hovered over the stop button, but I couldn't bring myself to press it. I had to know what came next. 3 a.m. the voice continued, now eerily calm. "I'll be waiting." I didn't know what to make of it. My mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation. Had someone played a prank on me? Or worse, was this a recording from someone else who had stayed in the cottage before me? Someone who had recorded it in some bizarre way. The idea of it being a prank seemed less likely with every passing second. This tape wasn't something I could easily explain. The recording stopped abruptly. Silence filled the room, and I sat there, staring at the cassette player, my pulse thudding in my ears. I had to remind myself to breathe. What had just happened? What was that tape? I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that there was something I wasn't seeing. I got up and went to the window, hoping the fresh air might clear my mind. The sky outside had already darkened, and the forest was a mass of shadows, the wind rustling through the trees. The cottage felt small and enclosed, like it was closing in on me. My gaze fell to the clock on the wall. It was 2:45 a.m. I hadn't planned on staying up this late, but the strange recording had kept me awake. The mention of 3 a.m. on the tape was enough to make me uneasy. I found myself staring at the clock, counting down the minutes. It was as if I was waiting for something that might happen when the clock struck 3. I glanced back at the cassette player. The tape was still inside. What was I supposed to do now? Should I leave it alone? Should I find out more? I couldn't just forget about it. My mind kept returning to the whisper. I'll be waiting. Waiting for what? And who was that voice? The minutes seemed to stretch longer and longer as I stood there, my eyes glued to the clock. By the time it finally hit 3 a.m., I was tense, every nerve on edge. I half expected something to happen, something out of the ordinary. I even turned to look at the door, as if expecting someone to knock, but the minutes passed and nothing happened. Still, something wasn't right. The air felt heavier, the silence deeper, as if the whole world outside had stopped. My fingers trembled as I pulled the tape out of the player. Maybe I was overthinking everything. Maybe it was just an old recording. But somehow, the quiet in the room seemed too thick to be natural. I placed the tape back in the drawer and closed it with a slow, deliberate motion. I wasn't sure what I was waiting for, but I knew I couldn't stay in the cottage much longer. Whatever that tape meant, it had left its mark on me. Story 23. The abandoned boarding school loomed in front of me, a hulking structure of crumbling brick and rusted metal. I had heard the stories about the place, whispers of it closing down abruptly, the students and teachers vanishing without explanation. I couldn't resist the pull of curiosity. With no one around for miles, the only sounds were the crunch of gravel beneath my boots and the soft, eerie wind that slipped through the broken windows. The front door was ajar, creaking on its hinges as I pushed it open. Dust and cobwebs clung to every surface, and the air smelled thick with decay. A chill ran down my spine, but I took a deep breath and stepped inside. The foyer was vast and empty, its walls lined with faded portraits of children long gone, their eyes seeming to follow me as I moved deeper into the building. The floor creaked beneath my feet, and the silence was almost suffocating. I walked past empty classrooms, some with chalkboards still covered in half-finished lessons. The faintest smell of old paper lingered in the air, and I could almost hear the ghosts of the past, the soft murmur of students, the scratch of pencils, the flutter of pages turning. But the place felt abandoned, desolate, as if no one had set foot here for years. I made my way to the dormitory wing, my footsteps echoing in the long, narrow hallways. The peeling paint on the walls was a dull shade of yellow, with the occasional crack where the plaster had fallen away. The doors to the dorm rooms were all open, each one leading into darkness. I hesitated before stepping into the first room, the faint feeling of being watched crawling up my back. What I saw inside made my heart skip a beat. The room was just as it would have been if the students had simply left for class and never returned. The beds were neatly made, the sheets crisp and white, and the blankets folded at the foot. The small desks beside each bed were arranged perfectly, pencils and books left untouched, as though waiting for the owners to come back. Even the curtains were drawn, allowing only a sliver of light to filter in. I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of unease as I stepped further into the room. It felt wrong, like time had frozen here. The air was thick with the weight of 1,000 unspoken stories. I ran my fingers over the edge of a desk, and it was cool to the touch, as if it hadn't been disturbed in years. Yet the beds were so pristine, so perfectly arranged. I shivered, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I moved to the next room down the hall, hoping for some sign of life, some explanation for the stillness. But the second dorm room was just as unnerving. The beds were made with military precision, the sheets tucked tightly around the mattresses, and the small trinkets on the windowsill sat undisturbed. There was a single book left open on the desk, but the pages were blank, the ink long faded. I couldn't understand it. Why would someone go to the trouble of leaving everything so perfectly in place? It was as if the school had simply stopped in time, but no one had bothered to pack up or clear out. No signs of struggle or distress, just the quiet emptiness of a place left behind. My breath caught in my throat as I turned toward the corner of the room. There, on the floor, lay a single shoe, its leather cracked and worn. It was the only sign that anyone had been here recently. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the scene, but I couldn't. I felt the weight of the silence pressing in on me, the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something was watching me. I moved quickly down the hall, passing room after room, each one the same beds neatly made, desks untouched, everything left as if waiting for the students to return from some long, indefinite absence. But no one ever did. The school had been closed for years. The sound of my footsteps seemed deafening in the stillness, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder more often than I would have liked. Finally, I reached the end of the hallway where a large set of double doors led into the main courtyard. I pushed them open and stepped out into the fading light of the evening. The air was cool, and the wind whispered through the trees, but there was an overwhelming sense of abandonment here, as if the entire place had been forgotten by the world. As I stood there, taking in the scene, I noticed something strange near the far corner of the courtyard. A small figure, no more than a shadow, darted between the broken columns of the old gazebo. My heart skipped in my chest, and I took a step forward, my curiosity pulling me toward it, despite the chill creeping over my skin. I crept quietly toward the gazebo, my steps careful and deliberate, but as I rounded the corner, the shadow vanished. I was alone again. There was no one there, just the broken structure, its rotting wood and rusted nails a stark reminder of the years of neglect. I scanned the area again, but everything seemed unchanged. The sense of unease lingered, and I realized I couldn't stay here any longer. The school, the empty dorms, the unmade beds, it was all too much. The quiet stillness felt wrong, unnatural. It wasn't just abandoned, it was forgotten. And whatever had happened here, whatever had caused the students and teachers to disappear, was still present, hanging in the air like a thick fog. As I made my way back toward the front door, I cast one last glance at the darkened dormitory windows. For a brief moment I thought I saw movement in one of them, a fleeting figure standing behind the glass. But when I blinked, it was gone. I didn't wait to investigate. I turned on my heel and left the school, the eerie silence of the place following me like a shadow. I never returned, but sometimes in the stillness of night, I hear the faint sound of footsteps, children's laughter, distant voices calling, as if the school is still waiting for its students to come back. Story 24. The train had always been my preferred way to travel. There was something about the rhythmic clattering of the wheels against the tracks that felt soothing, almost meditative. I had boarded the midnight train from the city, hoping to get some rest as we made our way through the winding mountain passes. The car was mostly empty, with only a few scattered passengers, all of whom were lost in their own world of sleep or quiet conversation. The lights above flickered as the train began its climb into the mountains. I settled into my seat by the window, pulling my jacket tighter around me as the cold air seeped in from the cracks around the glass. Outside, the darkness swallowed the landscape, the mountains looming like silent sentinels under the night sky. I closed my eyes, letting the sound of the train lull me into a deep sleep. When I woke up, the first thing I noticed was the silence. The usual hum of the train was gone, replaced by an eerie stillness that stretched on for miles. I rubbed my eyes and glanced around. The train car, which had been filled with passengers when I boarded, was now completely empty. Not a soul was in sight. Panic fluttered in my chest as I stood up and walked down the aisle. The car was pristine, untouched, as though the passengers had vanished into thin air. The overhead lights flickered again, casting long, ghostly shadows along the walls. My heart raced as I moved to the next car, only to find the same emptiness. There was no sound, no movement, nothing. I walked through each car with increasing dread, finding no trace of anyone who had been there before. The train seemed to have come to a stop, but I couldn't recall hearing it slow down. The only sound was the echo of my footsteps on the metal floor. It felt as if I was in some sort of forgotten space, isolated from the world. The realization began to settle, and somehow I was completely alone. I returned to my seat, trying to calm my racing mind. I checked my phone, but there was no signal, no connection to the outside world. The train had come to a halt in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by thick forests and the dark, imposing mountains. The landscape outside was unfamiliar, nothing like the usual stops I had passed through on the train's route. I glanced up and saw a station in the distance. It was a small, dimly lit platform shrouded in mist. I didn't remember passing it before. I stood and moved toward the door, my legs shaky as I made my way through the train. I needed to get off and figure out what was going on. Maybe I could find someone at the station, or at least get some answers. As I stepped off the train and onto the platform, the air felt unnaturally cold, biting at my skin. The station was quiet, too quiet. There were no signs of life, no other passengers milling about or waiting for the next train. The faint glow of the station lights barely pierced through the fog that clung to the ground. I took a hesitant step forward, my breath fogging in the cold night air. I walked toward the station, my footsteps muffled by the thick fog. The silence was deafening, pressing in on me from all sides. It felt as though the world had stopped turning, frozen in this strange, suspended moment. I tried the door to the station building, but it was locked. I looked around for any sign of life, any indication that I wasn't entirely alone, but the platform remained deserted. In a growing panic, I turned back to the train, hoping that perhaps someone would have appeared, or that the situation would make sense. But the train was still there, sitting motionless, with no other sign of activity. It looked as if it had been abandoned for years, its once pristine exterior now tarnished by age and neglect. I walked along the platform, my eyes scanning the dark mountainside that rose up behind the station. A faint light flickered in the distance, but it was far off, too far to reach. My thoughts were spiraling as I tried to make sense of what was happening. How had I ended up here? Where had everyone gone? I felt as though I was trapped in some twisted version of reality, a place that existed outside the bounds of time and space. I couldn't stay on the platform forever. I had to find out where the others had gone, or at least discover what had happened. I started walking toward the flickering light, my steps growing more frantic as I moved through the thick fog. The air felt dense, pressing against me as if trying to keep me from moving forward. But I pressed on, my eyes fixed on the dim light in the distance. As I got closer, the light grew brighter, and I saw a figure standing near a building. It was a man, tall and thin, with a long coat that billowed around him. His face was obscured by the shadows, but there was something strangely familiar about him. He didn't move as I approached, standing still like a statue. My heart raced in my chest as I called out to him, but he didn't respond. I stepped closer, feeling the weight of the silence pressing on me. I reached out, but as soon as my hand brushed the air in front of him, the figure vanished. There was no sound, no movement, just the sudden emptiness. My breath caught in my throat as I stumbled back, unsure of what had just happened. The fog closed in around me, thickening until I could barely see my own hands in front of my face. I turned back toward the train, the platform now completely invisible. In a blind panic, I ran toward where I thought the train had been, but all I found was an empty, desolate stretch of tracks. There was no train, no platform, no station. I stood there, breathless, my mind racing. Somehow I had become part of the train's twisted reality, trapped between worlds with no way out. The mountains loomed in the distance, silent and uncaring, as the fog swallowed everything around me. And there, in the deepening night, I was completely alone. Story 25. The back road was quiet. The kind of road you take when you're not really sure where you're going, but you're in no rush to get there. The trees on either side were thick, their branches weaving together to form a canopy that blocked most of the sunlight. The air felt damp, and the low hum of the tires against the gravel was the only sound breaking the silence. I'd been driving for hours, but something about this stretch of road felt different, like it was drawing me deeper into the unknown. As I rounded a curve, I saw the church. It was tucked away behind a bend, partially hidden by a thick line of trees. The building was old, the stones dark with age, and the roof sagged in places. But what caught my eye wasn't the structure itself, it was the doors. They were wide open, despite the lack of anyone around. I slowed down, curiosity peak. The church this far out in the woods didn't seem to make much sense, and the fact that the doors were open only added to the sense that something was off. I pulled over to the side of the road, the gravel crunching beneath my tires as I parked. The stillness was eerie, and I couldn't help but feel a twinge of unease. Still, I told myself I was just being paranoid, so I decided to take a quick look inside. The church was dark and cool as I stepped through the threshold. The faint smell of old wood and incense lingered in the air, a smell that felt strangely comforting despite the uneasy atmosphere. The wooden pews, which should have been lined up facing the altar, were instead arranged facing the back of the church, their worn seats looking toward the doors I had just entered. I took a step further into the room, my shoes muffled on the worn floorboards. I hesitated. There was no obvious reason for the pews to be facing the wrong way. I had been in enough churches to know that the arrangement was always the same. The congregation sat facing the altar. But here, the pews were turned, as though waiting for something or someone to come through the door. My heart rate quickened as I scanned the room, my eyes catching on the strange disarray. The altar at the far end of the church stood silent, unlit candles surrounding it, their wax melted down to nothing. The walls were bare, no decorations or religious symbols to be seen. It was as if the place had been abandoned for years, but those pews were too well maintained, too cared for, to be part of a forgotten place. My gaze moved to the back of the room, where a dim light flickered, coming from a narrow hallway that led deeper into the church. I felt a pull toward it, the same kind of pull you feel when you know you're not supposed to go somewhere, but you can't help it. The hallway was narrow, its walls lined with old portraits that seemed to watch me as I passed. The light at the end of the hallway grew brighter as I approached, its soft glow flickering like the flame of a dying candle. When I reached the end of the hall, I found a small room, almost like a study, with a heavy wooden desk in the center. On the desk sat an open book, its pages yellowed with age. I stepped closer, my curiosity outweighing warning bells in my head. The book was old, very old, and the writing on the pages was faded, as though it had been written in haste. I ran my fingers over the words, trying to make out the faint letters. There was one sentence I could barely read: "Do not turn your back." A cold chill ran through me, and I turned quickly, feeling the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting someone to be standing behind me, but the hallway was empty. I stood there for a long moment, trying to calm my racing heart. The church felt even colder now, the silence pressing in on me from all sides. I made my way back to the main room, but as I stepped into the church, I froze. The pews, those damned pews, had moved. No one was there, but they had shifted. It was subtle, but enough to make my blood run cold. The ones closest to the door were now angled, facing toward the back of the room, while the others had moved slightly as if they had been disturbed. A sense of dread washed over me, and I felt the weight of something watching me. I rushed for the door, but the moment I reached it, I heard a faint sound. A whisper, barely audible, like someone speaking my name. I turned sharply, my heart in my throat. There was no one in sight, no movement in the pews, but the whisper came again, louder this time. I stumbled backward, my hand on the doorframe. The air in the church had grown thick, and the shadows seemed to stretch toward me. The light from outside flickered, casting distorted shapes on the walls. And then, the whisper came again, only this time it was closer. It wasn't my name this time, it was a command. Sit. I spun around, my breath shallow. The pews, every single one of them, had now turned to face me, their rows perfectly aligned. My legs felt like jelly, but my body moved on its own, as though it was no longer under my control. I found myself walking toward the nearest pew, unable to stop myself. I sat down, my hands gripping the edge of the seat. The room was suffocating now, the air too thick to breathe, too cold to endure. I stared ahead at the empty altar, my eyes tracing the flickering light from the candles that had been extinguished. The whispers stopped, and for a moment there was nothing. Then I felt it. A presence standing behind me, just out of sight. I knew without looking that it was there. Someone had joined me in the church. The door slammed shut behind me. Story 26. I had always been drawn to history, especially the dark, forgotten corners of the past. So when I found myself near an old battlefield while traveling, I couldn't resist the pull to visit. The place was quiet, surrounded by dense woods and empty farmland, yet it held the weight of centuries of forgotten bloodshed. The air felt thick with something unspoken, as though the past still lingered in the wind, whispering its stories to those willing to listen. The battlefield had been preserved in a state of eerie stillness, with only a few stone markers to indicate where soldiers had once stood. The vast expanse of land stretched out in every direction, a sea of long, brittle grass swaying gently under the cool breeze. I walked slowly, letting my boots crunch softly against the dirt, imagining the lives that had once been lost here. There were no other visitors that day, which gave the place a haunting solitude, as if it had been abandoned by time itself. As I wandered further into the field, my eyes scanned the ground, half expecting to stumble upon some forgotten artifact, an old coin, a rusted button, or maybe a fragment of a musket ball. But instead, something strange caught my attention. In the middle of the field, surrounded by the overgrown grass, was a freshly dug hole. It wasn't small, and it certainly wasn't natural. The earth around it was disturbed, as though someone had recently been digging there. Curiosity got the better of me, and I approached the hole cautiously. The edges of the hole were uneven, and the dirt was dark, freshly turned, giving it a stark contrast to the dry, parched ground around it. My breath caught in my throat as I stared into the depths. There was something unsettling about it, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the hole seemed to almost pulsate with a strange energy, as though it had been waiting for something or someone. I took a hesitant step closer, peering into the hole. It was deep, far deeper than I had expected, and the walls were smooth, as though they had been carefully carved out. The earth smelled damp and rich, not like the dry soil of the surrounding field. A chill crept up my spine, and I instinctively stepped back, my heart beating faster than it should have been. The longer I stood there, the more I felt an overwhelming sense of unease. It was as though the hole was pulling me in, calling to me, demanding that I get closer. But I resisted the temptation, trying to shake off the odd sensation that was crawling under my skin. I looked around, as if expecting someone to appear and explain what I was seeing, but the field was still empty, and there was no sound except the wind rustling the grass. I glanced at my watch, realizing I had already been standing there for much longer than I intended. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the field. I made a decision to leave, but as I turned away, something caught my eye. A shape, barely visible against the darkening horizon, was moving toward the hole. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light or perhaps a figment of my imagination, but the figure grew clearer with each passing second. A man, dressed in what appeared to be old-fashioned military attire, was walking toward the hole. He was tall and thin, his uniform faded and worn, with patches of dirt and blood staining the fabric. His face was obscured by a long, dark beard, and his eyes, though distant, seemed to glow with an otherworldly intensity. The man didn't acknowledge me, he simply walked with a purposeful stride, his boots sinking slightly into the soft earth. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The man stopped just at the edge of the hole, looking down into its depths. For a long moment he stood motionless, as if waiting for something, or perhaps remembering something from the past. Then, without a word, he knelt down and began to dig. The sound of his hands scraping against the dirt was loud in the otherwise quiet field. I felt an overwhelming compulsion to leave, to run away from whatever was happening, but I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, my body refusing to obey my mind's frantic commands. The air grew colder, the wind picking up, swirling around me in an eerie dance. The figure continued to dig, his movements becoming more frantic, more desperate. It was as if he was searching for something buried deep within the earth. Suddenly, the man stopped digging and stood up. He turned his head toward me, his eyes locking onto mine. There was no recognition in his gaze, just an emptiness, a hollow void that sent a shiver down my spine. He took a step back from the hole, then another, as if giving me space to approach. But I didn't move. The man's lips parted, and for a moment I thought he might speak. Instead, he opened his mouth in a silent scream, his face contorting with a grotesque expression. The ground beneath me trembled slightly, and the earth around the hole shifted, as though the very land was alive, responding to his silent plea. My heart pounded in my chest, and in that moment I understood. The hole wasn't just a grave, it was a portal, a gateway to something far darker, something that had been waiting for centuries. I stumbled backward, my legs finally obeying my frantic instincts. My mind screamed at me to leave, to run as fast as I could, but my feet felt heavy, as though the ground itself was pulling me down. I glanced one last time at the hole, and in that fleeting moment, I saw the dark figure, standing motionless at the edge of the hole, waiting for me to return. With every ounce of strength, I turned and ran, never looking back, the sound of my footsteps echoing across the field, the wind howling in my ears. The battlefield was silent once more, as if nothing had ever happened, but I knew better. I had seen the hole, and whatever it had been, whatever it still was, it would not be forgotten. Story 27. I arrived at the Victorian Inn just as the evening sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the tall, ornate building. The place had an air of faded grandeur, with ivy creeping up the stone walls and delicate lace curtains fluttering in the windows. It was exactly what I had been looking for, a quiet, historic escape from the chaos of city life. The bell above the door chimed softly as I stepped inside, greeted by the scent of polished wood and lavender. The receptionist, an older woman with silver hair pulled into a neat bun, smiled warmly at me. "Welcome, dear. You must be the one who reserved the room for tonight." I nodded, confirming my booking. She handed me an old-fashioned key, its brass surface worn with age, and gave me directions to my room. "Room 305, she said. "Up the stairs at the end of the hall. It's one of our finest." I thanked her and made my way up the creaking staircase, the heavy wooden banister smooth beneath my hand. The walls were adorned with framed portraits, their faces staring down at me in silence, I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched as I walked down the narrow hallway, the dim light from the old sconces casting long, flickering shadows on the walls. When I reached room 305, the door was slightly ajar, the faint smell of stale air drifting out. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was large, with a grand four-poster bed draped in deep burgundy velvet. The walls were covered in dark floral wallpaper, and the old-fashioned furniture and antique dresser, a vanity with a tarnished mirror, added to the room's vintage charm. But something about it felt off. It wasn't the room itself, but the luggage. A large leather suitcase sat at the foot of the bed, its tan color faded and cracked with age. Next to it, a smaller travel bag rested on the wooden chair, its fabric worn and frayed. It didn't make sense. I hadn't seen anyone enter the room before me. The receptionist hadn't mentioned anything about previous guests. I set my bag down on the bed, feeling a strange unease settle over me. The suitcase looked old, but not ancient. It seemed like it had been packed only recently, the zipper still intact, the leather polished but weathered. I couldn't resist the urge to investigate. My fingers brushed over the worn surface, and I almost expected it to feel cold or dusty, but it was warm to the touch. The suitcase seemed too real, too present for something that belonged in a room that had been untouched for years. Curiosity got the best of me, and I bent down to unzip the suitcase. Inside, the clothes were neatly folded, the fabric soft and familiar, but nothing about the contents seemed out of place. A few pairs of socks, an old wool sweater, a pair of polished shoes. And yet, as I sifted through the items, I couldn't shake the feeling that the suitcase had been waiting for something or someone to return. I closed it quickly, stepping back from the suitcase. The weight in the room had shifted, and now I felt as though the air itself was pressing in on me. The faintest sound of footsteps echoed from somewhere down the hall. I froze, my heart racing. I turned, half expecting to see someone standing in the doorway, but it was empty. I glanced around the room, feeling the oppressive silence settle in once again. It was then that I noticed something else on the vanity table. A small journal sat open, its pages yellowed with age. I walked over and picked it up, feeling a strange pull in my chest as I turned the pages. The handwriting was neat, but the ink was faded, as though the author had written by candlelight years ago. The last entry was dated nearly 30 years ago. It read, "I've been waiting for so long, but I fear I may never leave. The room feels alive, like it's keeping me here, holding me against my will. Tomorrow I will try again. If I do not return, know that I never wanted to be trapped here. This place is not what it seems." My fingers trembled as I set the journal back down, a shiver crawling up my spine. Who had written this? Who had stayed in this room? And why had they never left? The pieces didn't add up. I walked to the window, hoping the fresh air would calm my nerves. The moon hung high in the sky, casting its pale light across the courtyard below. The inn looked peaceful from this vantage point, its stone walls now bathed in silver. Yet something felt wrong, like the walls were holding on to the past, unwilling to let go. The sound of footsteps returned, this time louder, more distinct. I turned to look toward the door, half expecting someone to appear. But again, no one was there. The room felt colder now, the shadows deeper, as if the very air had grown heavier. I pulled the blanket from the bed, deciding I would leave the room and try to speak with the receptionist again. But as I crossed the room, I heard the faintest rustling sound. It came from the suitcase. Slowly, I turned back, my heart pounding in my chest. The suitcase had shifted slightly, its position changed. I hadn't touched it, but there it was, as though someone had moved it while I wasn't looking. A knot formed in my stomach. The room had seemed quiet, lifeless, but now I wasn't so sure. I reached for the suitcase again, my hand shaking as I undid the zipper once more. Inside there was a single letter, yellowed with age, tucked into the corner of the case. I pulled it out carefully and unfolded it. The letter was addressed to no one in particular, just a simple note that read, "I'm sorry for what happened. They won't let me leave. I've tried everything." The words felt heavy, as though they carried a weight I couldn't comprehend. As I read them again, I felt a presence behind me. I turned slowly, but the room was empty. The door was still closed, the window still shut tight. And yet the air had shifted cold, unnatural. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. I left the room quickly, the letter still clutched in my hand. The door slammed shut behind me, and for a brief moment, I stood in the hallway, wondering if I had made a mistake by staying in that room. The inn, with its history and secrets, seemed to breathe around me, holding its secrets close, unwilling to let go. Story 28. The morning air was crisp as I set off on the trail leading to the old mining site. I had read about it in an obscure travel blog along an abandoned silver mine deep in the woods, far from any modern roads. The idea of hiking through history intrigued me, and so I found myself alone on the rugged path. The forest surrounding me with its thick canopy of trees. The trail was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a bird. As I walked deeper into the forest, the trees grew taller and the light dimmer, casting long shadows on the ground. The path was uneven, tangled with roots and loose rocks, but I enjoyed the solitude. The air smelled earthy, a mix of pine and damp moss, and I found myself breathing it in deeply. My legs ached from the climb, but I pressed on, eager to reach the mine before the afternoon sun disappeared. After what felt like hours, I rounded a bend and found myself standing before a weathered wooden sign that read Silver Ridge Mine. The sign was old, its paint chipped and faded, but still legible. Beyond the sign, I could see the remnants of the mine's entrance, a collapsed stone archway overgrown with ivy and moss. The area was eerily silent, the only sounds coming from the wind rustling through the trees. I walked cautiously toward the entrance, my boots crunching on the gravel and dirt. The stone archway loomed above me, its jagged edges sharp against the blue sky. The opening was partially obscured by thick vines and undergrowth, but I could see the faint outline of a tunnel beyond. I hesitated for a moment, wondering what I might find inside. Despite the curiosity gnawing at me, something about the place felt off, like I wasn't alone. I pulled my flashlight from my backpack and shone it into the tunnel. The beam flickered across the dark, damp walls, revealing the crumbling remnants of what had once been a thriving mine. Old tools lay scattered along the floor, rusted and forgotten, and bits of wood and metal littered the ground. The air inside the tunnel was musty, heavy with the scent of stale earth. I took a step inside, my heart pounding in my chest. That's when I heard it. A faint sound, almost lost in the breeze but unmistakable. The distant clang of metal striking rock. My breath caught in my throat. I froze, straining to listen. The sound was unmistakable, a pickaxe striking stone, over and over again, as though someone was still working deep within the mine. I stood there for a long moment, my mind racing. There hadn't been anyone around when I arrived, and the mine had been abandoned for decades. The only other people I had seen were a few hikers further down the trail, far from the mine's entrance. The noise seemed to come from deep within the tunnel, echoing off the stone walls. I stepped back, unsure whether I should investigate or leave. The thought of exploring deeper into the mine, knowing someone or something might be down there, was unsettling. But the curiosity that had driven me to this place pushed me forward. I had to know who or what was making that noise. I took another step, then another, my flashlight illuminating the dark path ahead. The sound of the pickaxe grew louder as I moved further into the mine. It was rhythmic, methodical, as if the person swinging the tool had been doing so for years, never stopping, never resting. I could almost hear the echo of it in my own ears, like the sound was being absorbed into the very walls of the mine. The tunnel began to narrow, the air thick with dust and the musty scent of old wood. I could barely make out the outlines of old mining carts and abandoned equipment, some of it half buried under piles of rocks and dirt. The pickaxe continued its relentless rhythm, each strike a steady thud in the silence around me. My pulse quickened as I approached a bend in the tunnel. The light from my flashlight flickered as I turned the corner, and that's when I saw it. The faint outline of a figure hunched over and working, the swing of the pickaxe echoing through the mine. They were dressed in old, ragged clothes, their face obscured by the shadow of their wide-brimmed hat. The figure's movements were jerky, almost mechanical, like they had been trapped in this place for far too long. I stood frozen, watching, unable to make a sound. The figure didn't notice me. They continued to strike the stone with their pickaxe, oblivious to my presence. The rhythmic sound seemed to grow louder, faster, as though the work was becoming more urgent, more frantic. I took a cautious step forward, my breath shallow in my chest. The figure's back was turned to me, but there was something unsettling about the way they moved. Their body was stiff, almost inhuman, and the air around them seemed unnaturally cold. I felt a chill crawl up my spine as I stepped closer. That's when I realized there was no dust rising from the ground. The pickaxe was striking stone, but no chips or debris fell from the wall. The figure's movements were smooth, too smooth, and their clothes looked too new, too clean. Suddenly, the figure stopped. The pickaxe hung in midair, frozen in time. The air grew colder still, and a low hum filled the space, vibrating through my bones. I held my breath, unsure of what to do next. The figure slowly turned their head toward me, their face hidden in shadow, but their eyes dark and hollow, pierced through the darkness. My heart stopped as the figure raised a hand and pointed directly at me. I could hear the faintest whisper, just on the edge of my hearing. "Leave." The voice was strained, as if it had been trapped in the walls for years, echoing off the stone. Without thinking, I turned and ran, my feet pounding the ground as I sprinted back toward the entrance. The sound of the pickaxe echoed in my ears, now distorted and frantic, like the figure was following me. My breath came in ragged gasps as I reached the entrance, the cool daylight spilling in from outside. I didn't stop until I was back on the trail, my chest heaving with fear. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figure standing in the tunnel watching me. But the mine was empty, silent once again. The only sound was the distant rustle of the leaves in the wind. I didn't look back as I made my way down the trail, my heart still racing. The image of the figure burned into my mind. Story 29. I had always been drawn to old places, the kind of locations that whispered of a bygone era. So when I stumbled upon the dilapidated movie theater tucked away on a quiet street, I couldn't resist. Its faded marquee, which had once proudly announced the latest films, now stood silent, the lights long since gone out. I pushed open the heavy wooden doors, greeted by the scent of dust and stale air. Inside, the theater was nearly as forgotten as its marquee. The red velvet seats were worn and threadbare, and the smell of old popcorn lingered faintly in the corners. The lobby was dimly lit by a few flickering bulbs, and the ticket booth was empty. The glass cracked, and the prices on the old sign faded to near invisibility. It was the kind of place that felt as though it had been suspended in time, a relic from the past. I wandered down the aisle toward the main theater, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet beneath me. The grand room stretched out before me, its once golden curtains now frayed and stained with age. The screen at the front of the room seemed to shimmer in the dim light, the only thing in the entire place that still held a sense of life. Curiosity urged me to sit, and I found a seat near the back, facing the screen. The projector in the back corner hummed quietly, and the lights flickered before fading completely. The screen came to life, but not with the usual classic film or an old reel. Instead, it showed footage of me walking into the building just moments before. I blinked in disbelief. It wasn't just a distant shot, it was as though someone had been standing in the lobby, filming me as I entered. I sat frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. The footage on the screen was in black and white, the grainy texture of an old film reel giving it a surreal quality. I could see myself walking in the front door, glancing around the lobby as I had just done moments ago. But there was no camera operator visible, and I couldn't understand how anyone could have filmed me so perfectly, especially without my noticing. The scene on the screen shifted. Now it was a closer shot, showing me walking down the aisle toward the seats. The angle was impossible, as though someone had been sitting in one of the rows, filming me as I made my way to my seat. I could even see the way my hand brushed against the armrest as I sat down. A cold chill crept up my spine, and I glanced around the theater nervously, expecting to see someone else lurking in the shadows. But the place was empty, silent, save for the hum of the projector. The film continued. The camera zoomed in on my face as I sat there, watching the screen in stunned silence. The image on the film was unsettlingly accurate. Every detail was captured perfectly, right down to the flickering light from the projector casting shadows on my face. How could this be happening? How could someone have known exactly what I was doing? My palms grew clammy and I instinctively stood up, ready to leave. But as I did, the film shifted again. This time, the camera wasn't focused on me. Instead, it was focused on the screen itself, where the footage of me was still playing. The image on the screen seemed to warp, as if the film was distorting, and for a moment, I thought I saw something or someone moving behind the flickering lights. I stopped in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. On the screen, there was a figure in the shadows, barely visible but unmistakably human. The figure was tall, shrouded in darkness, and seemed to be moving toward the screen, slowly but deliberately. It was as if the figure was emerging from the film itself, crawling out of the very footage that had been playing. My heart raced. I took a few hesitant steps back, but the figure on the screen continued to move, its shape growing more distinct. I tried to shake off the panic rising in my chest. It was just a trick of the film, I reasoned, some sort of optical illusion. But the longer I watched, the more real the figure seemed. It was as if the boundary between the screen and the room was blurring. I turned and rushed toward the exit, but before I could reach the door, the sound of the projector slowed, its grinding noise echoing through the theater. I whipped around to see that the footage had changed again. Now the figure on the screen was standing directly in front of me, its face obscured in shadow, but its presence undeniable. The tension in the room was suffocating, and I felt as though the air itself was thick with something unspeakable. I stopped in my tracks, my hand gripping the doorframe. My mind raced. This couldn't be real, could it? It had to be a prank or some sort of bizarre art project, right? But As I stared at the screen, I felt the undeniable sensation that I was no longer alone, that something had crossed from the world of the film into the physical world. The figure on the screen took a step forward, its movements deliberate and slow, as though it was walking toward me, inch by inch. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and my feet were rooted to the spot. I couldn't move, couldn't tear my eyes away from the screen. My breath became shallow as the figure continued to advance, its shadowy form now standing just a few feet from the screen. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the footage cut to black. The projector sputtered and died, its low hum fading into an unsettling silence. I stood frozen, staring at the blank screen. My heart thudded painfully in my chest, and my legs felt weak beneath me. It was as if the room itself had shifted, had become something darker, more oppressive. I took a step backward, my eyes darting around the theater, expecting to see the figure, expecting it to be standing somewhere in the room, watching me. But there was nothing. The theater was empty. The lights flickered back on, and everything seemed normal again. But the feeling of being watched, of having crossed some unseen boundary, lingered in the air. I didn't know if the figure had been real, or if I had imagined it. What I did know was that I couldn't stay in that theater any longer. I turned quickly and ran out the door, the sound of my footsteps echoing through the empty street as I fled into the night. As I glanced back over my shoulder, I could have sworn I saw the faintest flicker of movement inside the theater. But when I turned around, the door had already slammed shut behind me. Story 30. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden glow over the endless stretch of highway. I'd been driving for hours, the monotony of the road lulling me into a quiet daze. My gas gauge was dangerously close to empty, and I was growing tired. So when I saw a sign for a diner up ahead, I took the exit without hesitation. It wasn't marked on any map, but there was something about the place that caught my attention, rustic, almost out of place. I pulled into the parking lot, the gravel crunching beneath my tires as I parked. The diner was small, its neon sign flickering above the door, casting a soft, eerie light across the lot. The building looked as though it had been here for decades, maybe longer. Despite its age, it seemed well kept, with fresh flowers in pots near the entrance and clean windows that revealed a warm, inviting glow inside. I felt an odd pull to enter, as if the place had been waiting for me. The moment I opened the door, a small bell rang above me, signaling my arrival. The air was thick with the scent of freshly brewed coffee and sizzling bacon. As I stepped inside, the atmosphere immediately shifted. Every head in the diner turned in unison to look at me. It wasn't just a glance, but a full, deliberate turn, as though they had been waiting for me to arrive. I froze in the doorway, my heart pounding in my chest, unsure of what to do next. There were maybe a dozen people seated at the various booths and tables, all of them middle-aged or older. Their eyes were wide, unblinking, as they watched me with an unsettling intensity. The silence was oppressive, and the once welcoming warmth of the diner now felt cold, suffocating. Even the waitress, who had been wiping down the counter, stopped and turned to look at me. Her expression was neutral, but her eyes held something darker, an unspoken warning. I forced myself to step further into the diner, the sound of my boots echoing louder than I expected against the wooden floor. As I approached the counter, the air grew heavier, the weight of dozens of stairs pressing down on me. I tried to make myself as small as possible, resisting the urge to turn and run. The waitress finally moved toward me, her movements slow and deliberate. "What can I get for you on?" she asked, her voice sweet but hollow. She didn't smile, and her eyes never left mine. It felt like she already knew what I was going to say before I opened my mouth, I'll just have a coffee," I stammered, my throat dry. I sat down at the counter, trying to steady my nerves. The patrons continued to stare, their gazes unwavering, but no one spoke. It was as if time had stopped, and I was the only one moving in the room. I took a deep breath, hoping that the coffee would calm my nerves. The waitress placed a steaming mug in front of me without a word. I reached for it, my hand trembling slightly, and took a sip. The coffee was rich and strong, with a strange bitterness that lingered on my tongue. I glanced around the diner, trying to make sense of the situation. The patrons were still watching, but they weren't speaking to one another. No clinking of silverware, no soft murmurs of conversation, just the quiet hum of the refrigerator behind the counter and the occasional creak of the old building settling. I could feel the weight of their eyes on me, their gaze following every movement I made. I cleared my throat and turned back to the counter, staring into my coffee as if it might give me some answer, some explanation. But nothing came. I began to wonder if I had made a mistake coming here, if this place had always been this way, or if something was off about it, something I couldn't quite put into words. Minutes passed in complete silence. I took another sip of my coffee, the bitterness now tasting like something foul. I set the cup down with a clink and stood up, suddenly feeling suffocated. I had to leave. My mind was racing, and I needed to get out of there before the tension became too much. But just as I turned to head for the door, the waitress spoke again, her voice low, almost inaudible. "You don't want to leave," she said, her words so soft they barely reached my ears. "Not yet." I froze, my hand resting on the door handle, my body stiff with fear. Her voice had a peculiar quality, like a warning wrapped in a command. It was as though she knew exactly what I was thinking, knew exactly what I was about to do. I turned back slowly, and the entire diner seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something to happen. "Why?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I wasn't sure why I'd asked, but I couldn't stop myself. The waitress smiled then, a slow, almost imperceptible curl of her lips. It wasn't a smile of kindness or reassurance. It was a smile that chilled me to the bone. "Because you're not finished yet," she said, her eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made me feel small and insignificant. Before I could respond, the door opened, and a man stepped inside, tall and imposing. The entire diner's attention shifted to him in perfect unison, as if they had been waiting for him. I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. The man moved with purpose, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on me. "You're here," he said, his voice deep and smooth. There was no question in his tone. He knew exactly who I was. "I thought you would be." "Hey." My mind raced, but I couldn't make sense of it. What was happening? Who were these people? Why was I here? I couldn't speak, my throat dry as I stumbled backward. The man smiled, a knowing, almost predatory grin, and took a seat at the booth across from me. The patrons resumed their silent watching, their faces expressionless, as if waiting for something they could not control. It dawned on me then I wasn't the guest in this diner. I wasn't the one passing through. I had become part of whatever strange ritual these people were involved in, and I realized, with growing horror, that there was no escaping it.